close your eyes, if you haven't already, and let the sound of the world around you grow soft and distant. Because tonight we are going somewhere very old, somewhere so far back in time that the stars above it are almost the same stars you know, and the sea below them is the same ancient restless sea. And yet everything, every small thing, feels different, feels slower, feels somehow more alive with the weight of meaning. Tonight we are going to the shores of the Aegean, and we are going to sit there together for a little while, in the long, warm dusk of a world that believed in heroes. And if you find comfort in these slow night journeys, if this is the kind of voice you want to hear as you drift towards sleep, then it is worth knowing that there are more of these stories waiting for you. You can find them again and again, night after night, simply by subscribing, so that whenever the dark comes and the mind needs somewhere quiet to go, these tales will always be there, just a gentle reach away. And if you feel like it, before you close your eyes entirely, you might leave a small note in the comments, telling us where in the world you are listening from tonight. Because there is something quietly wonderful about knowing that somewhere in Norway, someone is hearing the same salt wind as someone in New Zealand, or Brazil, or Japan, all of us drifting together into the same old dreaming ocean. But for now, let us begin. Imagine the smell first. That is always the best way to enter an ancient world, not through its monuments, not through its battles, but through something the body remembers before the mind does. The smell of the Aegean at dusk is salt and thyme and the faint sweetness of sun-warmed stone, and underneath all of it, always, the deep cold breath of water that has been moving since before any human eye watched it move. The sea here does not crash and thunder the way some seas do. It glitters and shifts and pulls back from the pale gravel shore with a long whispering sound, like someone slowly turning the page of a very old book. And then it comes forward again, soft and insistent, and turns the page again, and has been doing so for longer than any story can reach. This is the Aegean, the inland sea of the ancient Greeks, and it lies at the center of the world they knew, or at least at the center of the world as they understood it, which is really the only center that matters when you are trying to feel your way back into the past. It is not a vast ocean. It is intimate by the standards of seas, clustered with islands that rise from the water like sleeping animals, their backs covered in scrub and silver-green olive trees, their cliffs catching the last light of afternoon and holding it just a moment longer than the water below them does. You could sail from one island to the next in a day, in a few hours of good wind, and the ancient sailors did exactly this, threading their small wooden ships through the channels between Lesbos and Chios and Samos and the 100 smaller places that had names once and now have only ruins and the memory of names. It was somewhere around 3,000 years ago, or perhaps a little more, that the stories we are going to tell each other over these coming nights were first being shaped, not written down yet, because writing was a new and uncertain thing in this part of the world, but carried in mouths and memories, passed from singer to singer around fires that burned in the open air. The age that those singers described was already old to them, already legendary, already wrapped in the particular golden haze that settles over times we cannot quite reach. They called it the Age of Heroes. And what they meant by that was a time when the distance between the human world and the divine world was thinner than it would ever be again. A time when the gods did not merely watch from their high, cold mountain, but moved through the olive groves and along the shore roads, sometimes wearing the faces of strangers, sometimes wearing their own terrible beauty, loving mortals and quarreling with them, and weeping over them the way mortals weep over each other. The gods of this world were not distant or abstract. They had preferences and grudges and desires. They loved certain cities and despised others. Aphrodite, born from sea foam, carried in her presence the warm, unhinging feeling of desire, and wherever she walked, the air changed. Poseidon, who held the deep water in his hands, could shrug and send the waves against a coastline and break it, or could let the sea lie still and glassy as a bowl of silver. Apollo moved with the slow brightness of the sun itself, and when he was displeased, the story goes, his arrows came from far away, unseen, the way sickness comes. And Athena, gray-eyed, clear-headed Athena, who loved craft and strategy and the particular courage of a mind that does not panic, she kept her eye on certain men, and those men felt it, a steadiness at their back, a clarity in moments of confusion, as though a cool hand had briefly rested on their shoulder. In this world, the line between a man and a god was not always clear, because often enough they shared blood. A god might love a mortal woman and leave something of their nature in the child that came after, and that child would grow up feeling in their body a restlessness and a capacity that ordinary life could not quite hold, a speed, a strength, a luminousness that made other people turn and look without quite knowing why. These children were the heroes, the half-divine ones, and their lives burned brighter and usually shorter than the lives of those around them, the way a fire burns brightest just before it dims. The landscape they moved through was one that rewarded slowness of attention. The hills of the Greek mainland and the islands that scattered away from it were not gentle hills. They were old and rocky and dry in summer, the soil thin and reddish between the stones, the trees growing with that particular stubbornness of plants that have learned to live on very little. Olive trees above all. The olive tree was everywhere in this world, silver-leafed and ancient, its trunk twisting over centuries into shapes that looked almost like figures frozen mid-gesture, and its fruit oily and bitter and absolutely essential to everything, to food, to light, to the careful tending of skin and hair, and the wooden hulls of boats. There was the soft, constant sound of leaves turning in the breeze, each one catching the light differently, so that a whole grove and wind looked like something breathing. And the wind itself was a presence here, not merely weather. The Aegean had its own winds with their own names and their own characters. The Meltemi that came down from the north in summer, cold and purposeful, pressing the waves into white ridges and filling sails with a fullness that made sailors grateful and nervous in equal measure. And the softer breezes of spring and early autumn that moved through the thyme and the wild oregano and carried their fragrance out over the water for miles, so that sailors approaching land could smell the shore long before they could see it. This was a world where you could navigate by smell, where the world communicated with you through every one of your senses at once. And perhaps that is part of why the people who lived in it felt so certain that the gods were near, because the world was so intensely, presently alive around them, that it seemed impossible it could be empty of intention. Into this world, into this salt-bright, wind-threaded, god-haunted world at the edge of its own long memory, we are going to follow one story above all others. It is the story of a boy who was born on the border between the human and the divine, who grew up in the high forests of a mountain under the care of a being who was himself a border creature, half man and half horse, and who moved through his short blazing life like something that was always too bright and too fast to last. His name was Achilles, and the sea was in his blood from the very beginning, because his mother was of the sea, and the sound of it would follow him everywhere, to the mountain, to the island, to the long gray shore of Troy. But that is a story for the chapters ahead, and they will unfold slowly and gently, the way the Aegean itself unfolds, one long soft wave after another, each one carrying you a little further from the shore of waking, a little deeper into the dreaming past. For now, simply let the salt wind move through your thoughts, and let the olive trees turn their silver leaves, and let the water pull back from the gravel with that slow whispering sound. The salt is on your lips before you even open your eyes to it, that particular sharpness of the Aegean in the hour before full dark, when the water has given up the last of the afternoon's warmth, and the air coming off the sea carries with it the cold depth of everything that lies beneath the surface, all that ancient, unfathomable blue. It is a good smell to carry into sleep, the smell of a world that is older than any name we have for it. And it is into that world, that deep, salt-breathing, star-attended world, that we return tonight, to find the story of a child who was not quite of either shore he was born between. Before we can speak of Achilles, we must speak of his mother, and to speak of his mother, we must go down to the water. Thetis was a Narrated, which is to say she was one of the 50 daughters of the old sea god Nereus, and she belonged to the sea the way the tide belongs to it, not by force or habit, but by nature, by the very substance of what she was. The ancient poets imagined her moving through those green-black depths as easily as light moves through still water, trailing silver behind her in the dark. And when she rose to the surface, the waves around her would settle, the story goes, as if even the Aegean understood that something luminous had come up from below. She was among the most beloved of all the sea-nymphs, renowned across the divine world not only for her beauty, but for something older and harder to name, a kind of deep, foreknowing sadness that the gods sometimes recognized in beings who have glimpsed too clearly how things must end. It is said that Zeus himself once desired to take Thetis as his bride, and that Poseidon had looked upon her with longing, and that both drew back when the prophecy reached them, the old inexorable word that the son of Thetis would surpass his father. No god, it seemed, wished to father his own undoing, and so Thetis, who might have been a queen of heaven or of the deep, was instead given in marriage to a mortal man. His name was Peleus, a king of Phthia in the south of Thessaly, a man spoken of in the old stories as noble and strong-hearted, one of those mortals whom the gods occasionally honored with a nearness to the divine. He was not an ordinary man. He had sailed with the Argonauts, the story goes, had hunted the great Caledonian boar, had known heroes and been counted among them, but he was mortal nonetheless, and the distance between mortal and immortal is one that no amount of valor entirely bridges. The wedding of Peleus and Thetis is one of the oldest stories in the Greek world, spoken of long before Homer, echoed in the oldest fragments of verse that have survived the long centuries in their crumbled, partial way. All the gods were said to have attended, coming down from Olympus in their radiance to celebrate the union, and it is said that the Muses sang, and that the mountains of Thessaly were filled with the sound of celebration and divine laughter. There is something quietly extraordinary about imagining it. The Sea-Nymph in her silver and sea foam sitting beside a mortal king beneath the wide open sky of a Thessalian evening, the stars beginning their slow appearance overhead, the wedding torches burning amber and yellow along the hillside, the gods themselves gathered as witnesses to a joining that was both honored and in some quiet way already touched with grief. For Thetis knew what Peleus could not fully know, which is that the son she would bear him, the child already implicit in the weight of prophecy, in the careful arrangement of the divine world that had made this marriage necessary. She knew it, the way she knew the current beneath the Aegean surface, the way she knew the depth of cold water, which is not knowledge acquired, but knowledge felt, as much a part of her as the salt in her hair and the green light in her eyes. She would love him with all of that foreknowing tenderness, which is perhaps the most heartbreaking kind of love, the love that tends a flame, while understanding the wind is already gathering somewhere beyond the hillside. His name, when he came, was Achilles. What he looked like as a very young child the ancient sources do not dwell on at length, but the poets gave him brightness, a quality of light, as if something of his mother's luminous origin clung to him, as if the sea itself had left a trace on the child it had sent up into the air and the daylight of the mortal world. He was born in Phthia, in the mild rolling country of Thessaly, where the rivers run cold out of the mountains, and the olive trees grow silver gray in the wind off the sea, and his earliest years were lived in that quiet, green-scented world between the mountains of the Aegean coast. There is a story, old, persistent, told and retold until it has the worn smoothness of a stone that many hands have touched, about what Thetis did to try to protect her son from the fate she knew was waiting for him. The most famous version says that she took the infant Achilles to the river Styx, that dark and sacred boundary water at the edge of the world of the living, and dipped him in its current to make him invulnerable, holding him by the heel as she lowered him into the water. And it is said that where the water touched him, which was everywhere except the heel, the one small place where her hand held him above the current, his skin became proof against the weapons of war, against iron and bronze, against the ordinary violence of the world. It is a story the ancient Greeks themselves told in varying ways, and scholars and readers across the many centuries since have turned it over gently, understanding it perhaps less as a literal account and more as an image, a mother's impossible effort to shield her child from everything the world intends for him, and the equally impossible truth that there is always, inevitably, one place where the mortal world can still reach in, the heel, the small human fact of holding on. The myth, in its deepest nature, is not about weakness. It is about love, and the specific sorrow of a love that cannot complete its own intention, that tries to give immortality, and succeeds everywhere except the one place where the giving hand was, where the love itself was located. But Thetis also knew, the story goes, that her son carried within him a choice, or something very near a choice. There was one fate in which Achilles lived a long, unremarkable, mortal life, years of quiet accumulation, seasons, turning in Phthia, the slow pleasures of a life that stretches out and grows old in its own unhurried way, and passes from the world, like all mortal things pass, gently, in the dark. And there was another fate, shorter and blazing, in which the name of Achilles would outlast every stone in every city men had built, or would build, would be spoken as long as there were human voices to speak it. How much of this Achilles understood, or would come to understand, is something the old stories return to often, always with that quality of gentle, wondering sadness. He was a child before he was a hero, and before the weight of those great fated choices settled onto him, there were still the ordinary mortal hours, the salt wind off the sea in Phthia, the olive trees moving, the particular quality of morning light in Thessaly that falls clean and pale over the countryside before the day's heat begins. And it was in those years, the story goes, before the boy could fully know what he was, that his mother arranged for him something extraordinary, a childhood unlike any other, on the high green slopes of a mountain, where the world was older and quieter than anywhere he had yet been, in the keeping of a teacher who was neither God nor man, but something of both, something ancient and gentle, and entirely suited to the task of shaping a child who was himself caught between two worlds. The mountain was Pelion, rising above the eastern coast of Thessaly, where it faces out toward the wide Aegean, its slopes fragrant with pine and wild herbs, and the thousand cool, resinous scents that come down off a mountain in the early morning. And the teacher waiting there in his cave on the hillside was the centaur Chiron, who was said to be the wisest of all his kind, patient and learned, and possessed of a quietness that the forest itself seemed to mirror. It is toward that mountain that the boy Achilles was carried, and it is there that we will follow him next, up through the tree line and into the cool herb-scented air of the high slopes, where the sound of the sea below grows gradually softer, and the sound of wind through pine takes its place, steady, unhurried, like the slow breathing of the world itself, settling toward rest. The mountain breathes before dawn, high on the forested slopes of Pelion, where the land rises from the Thessalian coast in long green folds, and the oak trees grow so thick their canopy holds the darkness long after the sky has begun to pale. There is a stillness that belongs to no particular hour and no particular age, a stillness that seems to exist outside of time entirely, as though the mountain itself is dreaming, and everything that lives upon it is simply moving through the texture of that dream. The mist comes up from the valleys below, slow and white and unhurried, winding between the trunks of the trees, pooling in the hollows, threading itself through the ferns that grow in dense low carpets, wherever the light can find a way down through the leaves. And in this mist, in this green cathedral silence, a boy is learning what it means to live. His name, of course, is Achilles, though up here in these early years, before the world has yet formed its great ambitions around him, he is simply a child, bright-eyed, quick-footed, with the sea-pale look of his mother's divine blood softening the more angular Thessalian features of his father. He is perhaps 7 years old when Peleus brings him to the cave on Mount Pelion, or perhaps younger still. The old stories do not always agree on the precise age, settling instead for the impression of smallness, of a child who arrives at the threshold of something vast and ancient, and has not yet learned to feel afraid of it. And the threshold is exactly that, the entrance to Chiron's cave, set into the mountainside like a secret kept by the rock itself, its mouth half hidden by trailing ivy and the broad flat leaves of something dark and medicinal, the interior breathing a coolness that smells of stone and thyme, and the low particular sweetness of drying herbs hung from the ceiling in long patient bundles. Chiron, the centaur, has lived on this mountain for longer than anyone can reliably say. He is not like the other centaurs, those wild, ungoverned creatures of appetite and disorder, who appear in other stories as a kind of animal chaos given form. Chiron is something altogether different, something that the Greeks understood as a wonder rather than a threat. From the waist upward he is entirely a man, broad-shouldered and grave-faced, with eyes of a brownish amber that hold in them an expression of measured, permanent patience, as though he has seen enough of the world's generations to no longer be surprised by any of it. From the waist downward he is hoarse, a deep bay, his coat carrying the particular warmth of a chestnut in afternoon light, his four hooves making a soft percussion on the cave stone floor as he moves, unhurried, among his jars and his scrolls and his drying plants, It is said that he was the son of the old Titan Cronus, born of an unusual parentage that placed him outside the ordinary orders of things, neither fully divine nor fully animal, and it is perhaps this in-between nature that makes him so suited to teaching those who are themselves caught between two worlds. Achilles arrives, and Chiron receives him. There is no grand ceremony in the old accounts, no formal declaration. The boy is left on the mountain with the ancient teacher, and the mountain becomes his schoolroom, his nursery, his whole world. The cave is warm enough in the deep hours of the night, warmed by the body heat of the great centaur himself, who sleeps lightly, and by the small fire that burns in a hollow of the rock, its orange light licking across the rough stone walls in patterns that shift like something alive. The smoke finds its way out through a natural fissure in the ceiling, rising into the mountain air above. And sometimes on clear nights, it is said, you could see that thin gray thread rising from the rock face and know by it that something worth knowing was happening inside. The education of Achilles on Mount Pelion is described in the old sources with a kind of wondering tenderness, as though those who passed the stories down were themselves wistful for such a childhood, for such a teacher, and such a place. Chiron teaches the boy to play the lyre. This is not a small thing, not an ornament added to a warrior's training for the sake of appearances. In the understanding of that world, music was a form of knowledge, a way of touching what could not be touched by the hands alone. And the patient centaur sits with the boy in the firelit cave through long evenings, adjusting the position of his fingers, letting him hear the intervals, teaching him first to listen before he teaches him to play. The lyre that Achilles learns on is old even then it seems, its wood smoothed by many hands, its strings requiring regular careful adjustment in the mountain's changing air. In the Iliad, that great weaving of everything that Achilles was and is and would become, Homer shows us the hero years later, still playing his lyre in his tent by the shore at Troy, playing it quietly, alone, for no audience but himself and Patroclus. The habit, the comfort, the inwardness of it, all of that was laid down here, on this mountain, in the firelight of Chiron's cave. And then there is medicine. Chiron is called by some the first physician, or at least the teacher of physicians, and his knowledge of plants is something the old accounts return to with particular care, as though it seemed to those early storytellers a very precious thing, the idea that the greatest warrior of his age was also taught to heal. The mountain provides everything Chiron needs for his lessons. The boy learns to recognize plants by touch and scent as much as sight, to know the difference between what soothes and what harms, between what closes a wound and what opens a fever's grip. He learns the names of things, root and bark and leaf and flower, the particular properties of this earth and this altitude, the way that plants found growing near water differ from those that grow on the high exposed ridges where the wind comes directly off the sea. He carries bundles of them back to the cave in the late afternoons, the smell of green and crushed stem rising from his small arms, and Chiron shows him how to dry them, how to prepare them, how to know what is needed. And then there is the hunt. The mountain offers this too. The long green silences of the upper forest, the light coming down through the trees in slanted columns full of moving dust, and the smallest of insects. The ground soft underfoot with the accumulated falls of many seasons. Chiron teaches Achilles to move through this world without disturbing it unnecessarily, to read the marks that animals leave in soft earth, to feel the shift in air that means something large is nearby, to be patient in a way that does not feel like waiting. The boy runs too, because he is drawn to running in a way that seems native to him, effortless, as though speed is simply his natural relationship to the ground. The old stories like to dwell on this, on a young Achilles racing barefoot down the mountain's steep slopes, through fern and root and loose stone, fleet enough, it was sometimes said, to run down a deer. In the evenings, after the lessons and the hunts, and the long mountain days, there is the cave again, and the fire, and Chiron's steady presence. Sometimes the centaur tells stories of the Olympians, of the older powers, of the heroes who have come before, whose names are already half legend. And the boy listens, wrapped in something warm against the mountain air, his breathing slowing as the fire settles into its quieter rhythms, the orange light finding the walls and the hanging herbs, and the amber eyes of the old teacher, who watches his student sleep with an expression that the stories cannot quite name, something between tenderness and knowledge, as though Chiron can already see the whole shape of this child's life, the brightness and the brevity of it, and has chosen, very deliberately, to say nothing of what he sees. The fire burns low on Mount Pelion. The mist comes up from the valleys, as it always does, and the mountain holds its dreaming silence, and the boy sleeps deeply in the way that only the very young and the very tired can sleep, completely, without reservation, without a thought of what might come. The herbs hang in their patient bundles, the old centaur breathes beside his fire, and the mountain simply continues, as mountains do, green and ancient and unhurried, cradling this small bright life in its forests a little longer before the world begins to ask for him. There will be time in the days that follow to wander further through these slopes and meadows, to feel the full texture of this mountain life, its slow mornings and its bright afternoons, the weight of the air at different hours, the sounds that belong to this particular place, but that is for another gentle drift through the mountain. For now let the cave hold you, and let the fire settle, and let yourself rest somewhere in those green Thessalian heights, where the smoke rises thin and gray into the stars, and nothing is yet required of anyone. The mountain breathes before dawn in a way that is almost like sleeping itself. A long, slow exhale of cool air moving down through the pine corridors and beech groves, carrying with it the scent of resin and damp earth and something older than either, something mineral and green that has no name in any language spoken on the plains below. On Mount Pelion, in those long-ago mornings that the old stories remember only softly, the darkness did not lift all at once, but dissolved gradually, the way a dream dissolves, the edges going first, the shapes of the great trees emerging one by one from the gray, until the whole forest stood revealed in that pale, sourceless light that belongs to no particular hour and feels as though it has been there always. The boy would have known this light well. He would have woken to it inside the deep cave that Chiron called home, that broad and sheltered hollow in the limestone face of the mountain, where the smoke of last night's fire still drifted in pale threads near the ceiling, and the smell of wood smoke was woven into everything. The furs that served as bedding, the dried herbs hanging in bundles from the natural shelves of stone, the rough wool of the cloaks hung near the entrance to air. It is said the cave faced eastward, and so the first true sunlight of each morning would have come in at an angle across the stone floor, a long golden stripe of it arriving slowly, traveling across the ground, the way a tide comes in, touching first the scattered pine needles and small stones near the entrance, then the clay pots and the wooden cups set near the cold ashes of the fire, then at last the sleeping place of the boy himself, warm and golden on his closed eyelids until they opened. There is something profoundly settling about imagining that cave in the full quiet of its ordinary mornings. Not the extraordinary days, not the days of lessons and revelations, but simply the ordinary ones, when the mountain was just the mountain, and the child was just a child waking slowly into the world. The drip of water somewhere deep in the rock, rhythmic and patient, marking time in drops rather than days, the rustle of something small and unseen in the leaves just outside the entrance, the distant, unhurried sound of a stream finding its way downhill through the ferns, as it had found its way every morning since long before any human being had climbed this mountain or given it a name. By full morning, the forest would have been alive in all its small particular ways. Pelion is a mountain that faces the Aegean on one side and drops away into green valleys on the other, and so it catches the sea wind even deep in its interior, a constant gentle pressure moving through the high branches, setting them in slow motion, filling the forest with a sound like breathing, or like distant water, a sound so constant it became part of the silence rather than an interruption of it. The beech trees on the upper slopes held their leaves in trembling silver-green arrangements, and in the late morning, when the sun was high enough to reach them, they translated the light into something liquid and shifting, pouring it down through layer after layer of leaves until it arrived at the forest floor dappled and broken into pieces, moving gently across the moss and the dark earth. The boy ran in this light. He would have learned its patterns intimately, the way it gathered in clearings and thinned under the oldest trees, the way it vanished suddenly when a cloud passed, and the whole forest went quiet and gray for a moment, as though holding its breath, and then flooded back again, warmer than before. He would have learned the mountain, the way mountain children have always learned such places, not by being told, but by inhabiting, by spending so many hours in a place that the place becomes part of the body's own knowledge, so that the feet find the path without the mind needing to remember it, so that the hands know instinctively which branches hold weight and which will give way. There were herbs to gather in the morning, when the dew was still on them, and their oils were strongest. This was among the first things Chiron is said to have taught, not warfare, not the great heroic skills the stories hurry toward, but the patient art of knowing what grows and what each growing thing can do. The mountain was a kind of library in this way, its slopes arranged not in shelves but in altitudes and aspects, each height and each direction of sunlight producing its own particular community of plants. Lower down, in the shaded gullies, where the soil stayed damp, certain plants grew that could cool a fever or close a wound. Higher, in the rocky meadows where the wind had more authority and the soil was thin and bright, other plants grew with stronger, sharper properties, their small flowers appearing in colors so vivid against the gray stone that they seemed almost deliberate, placed there by someone with a purpose. The meadows themselves deserved their own quiet consideration, because they were among the most beautiful places on the mountain, and the stories, when they trouble to mention them at all, do not linger there long enough. In summer these high clearings would have been full of grass grown long and seeding, bending in waves when the wind crossed them, and wildflowers in quantities that seem almost improbable now, the kinds of densities and varieties that existed in a world before the slow diminishments of later centuries. Yellow and white and blue and a particular shade of purple that exists nowhere in the world except in the petals of certain mountain flowers and certain lights, a color that has no satisfactory name. Insects move through all of this with the preoccupied industry of creatures who have exactly enough time for what they need to do, and their collective sound in the full warmth of a summer afternoon was a low, continuous hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the air itself, from the very substance of the day. The boy would have lain in that grass sometimes, as children lie in grass when the day is warm and the lessons are done and there is no particular reason to move, looking up at the sky through the seed heads of the tall grasses, the world reduced to that intimate framing, the blue coming through in broken pieces, a cloud moving with tremendous slow purpose from one edge of this small sky to the other, the smell of warm earth and crushed grass, and that high clean scent of mountain air that carries in it some faint reminder of the sea far below, salt and distance woven into the wind even here, even on these inland slopes. In the evenings the mountain changed its character entirely, and became something more solemn and more tender at the same time. The long light of the afternoon gradually warmed and reddened, and the shadows of the trees grew out across the clearings at impossible lengths, thin and blue, pointing eastward toward the sea. The birds that had been silent through the heat of midday began again, filling the cooling air with sounds that seemed to belong specifically to this hour, to this quality of light, to the particular mixture of relief and melancholy that comes at the end of a summer day, when the warmth is draining out of the air, and the first suggestion of night is present in the shadows under the trees. Chiron's fire, lit in the evening at the cave's entrance, would have been visible from some distance through the trees, a warm point of orange light in the gathering blue of dusk, pulling the eye toward it the way fire always pulls the eye, the way it has always done, from the very first time a human being sat beside one and felt the darkness held back at a comfortable distance and was glad. The smoke rising from it caught the last of the daylight, while the ground below had already gone gray, and moved in slow, unpredictable spirals into the cool air above the mountain, carrying its smell of pine resin and char into the forest, and down the slopes, and eventually, perhaps, all the way to the shore far below, where the sea received it without comment, as the sea receives everything. This was the world that made him. Not the battles, not the gleaming armor, not the great bronze-voiced pronouncements of fate that the stories will eventually require, but this mountain and its seasons, this fire in this forest, this unhurried education in the texture of the living world, a boy learning to be still before he learned to be swift, learning to listen before he learned to speak, learning the names of small things in the dark, before the great names found him and would not let him go. And somewhere, perhaps on a distant island where the sea light falls differently, where the air smells of thyme and salt water rather than pine and earth, a different kind of life was waiting, quieter in its way, more sheltered, but touched with its own strange beauty, its own slow rhythms, its own particular quality of dreaming. The wind changes on the slopes of Pelion before anyone has spoken a word. It is one of those shifts that happens in the very last hour before dawn, when the mountain exhales something cooler and older than the night that came before it, and the olive leaves on the lower slopes turn their silver undersides to the dark sky, as if listening for something they cannot quite name. Chiron would have felt it perhaps, standing at the mouth of his cave with his broad chest turned toward the east, reading the air the way he read everything, slowly, without hurry, with the patience of a creature who had watched many seasons turn on that mountain and expected to watch many more. And the boy sleeping inside, curled in the warm hollow of his sleeping place with his lyre resting close beside him, would have shifted in his sleep without waking, some animal part of him registering the change even before his dreaming mind could form a thought around it. But there are winds that carry more than weather, and this is the kind of story in which a mother's love moves through the world like a current beneath the surface of the sea, felt long before it is seen, arriving before it is expected, shaping the course of everything it touches without ever being still. Thetis had always known. That is the weight at the center of her story, the thing that makes her love for Achilles so particular and so aching. She had known from the very beginning what shape his life would take, or rather, what two shapes it might take, pressed against each other like two faces of the same stone. The stories tell it differently in different places, but the oldest threads of the telling agree on this. There was a prophecy, and it came early, and it was not vague in the way that prophecies sometimes are, wrapping their meanings in riddles and smoke. This one was plain. Achilles could live a long life, quiet and full and forgotten, the years settling over him like silt over a riverbed, his name dissolving after a generation or two into the general silence of the past. Or he could live a short life, brilliant and terrible and permanent, the kind of life that gets pressed into stories and carried across centuries like a coal still warm from the original fire. She knew which one the world would choose for him, if the world were given the chance. She had watched enough of the world to understand that. And so she loved him the way that only someone who knows the cost of a thing can love it, with a particular quality of attention, a tenderness that has grief already folded into it, the way bread has salt already folded in before you ever taste it. She had dipped him in the river, it is said, lifting him by the heel and letting the dark water of the Styx close over every part of him she could reach, trying to press immortality into mortal flesh through sheer force of a mother's will. The heel where her fingers held him stayed dry, stayed vulnerable, stayed human. There are some things that even a goddess cannot quite reach. He grew beautifully on the mountain under Chiron's care. She watched him from a distance, the way the sea watches the shore, always present, always in motion, always slightly apart. She watched him learn to run along the high ridges with the deer. She watched his hands find their way around the strings of a lyre, with the same sureness they found their way around a javelin. She watched him sit with the old centaur in the long afternoon light, while Chiron named the stars and the herbs and the slow principles of healing. And she felt, each time she watched, the double sensation that must be particular to mothers who love their children in full knowledge of what is coming. The swelling pride, and beneath it, always, the quiet pull of dread, like a tide beginning to turn. He was perhaps 15, or perhaps 16. The stories are gentle on the specifics, when the first rumors of a great gathering began to move through the Greek world like smoke through still air. A fleet was being assembled. A war was being called. The sons of kings and heroes were being collected from their training grounds and their islands and their mountain retreats, drawn together by oaths sworn long ago over a woman's hand, oaths that Menelaus of Sparta was now calling due. The name Troy began to appear in the conversations of men, spoken with the mixture of excitement and unease that comes with the naming of something large and distant and not yet real. Thetis knew when she heard it that the current had begun to run, She came to Pelion, she came to Achilles, and what passed between them in that meeting, the stories do not record in full, which seems right, because there are conversations between mothers and their children that belong entirely to the two people having them, and to no one else. What we are told is that she asked him to come with her. What we are told is that she had made arrangements, that she had spoken with a king she knew, a king named Lycomedes, who ruled the island of Skyros in the Aegean, a rocky sun-warmed island rising from blue water, like a shoulder lifted from the sea. And the arrangement was this. Achilles would go to Skyros. He would live in the palace of Lycomedes, among the king's daughters, dressed as a girl, moving through the soft domestic interior of island life as one of them, learning their rhythms, their weaving and their laughter, their long unhurried afternoons on the sea-facing terraces. He would be hidden inside an ordinary life. The war would not find him if the war could not see him. It is said that he went willingly. It is also said that he went reluctantly, that a young man who had been raised on a mountain to run with deer and learn the names of stars did not move easily into the enclosed world of palace women. Both of these things may be true at the same time, because we contain more than one feeling about most of the large decisions of our lives, and Achilles was already, even at 15 or 16, more than one thing at once. He was given a name among the girls, Pyrrha, it is said, meaning something like the red-haired one, which suited him, because his hair ran toward that copper-gold color that catches the light and seems almost to generate its own warmth. He learned to move differently, more slowly, more inward. He learned to sit at a loom and let his hands find the rhythm of it. He learned to lower his voice when it needed lowering, to keep the particular quality of stillness that the daughters of Lycomedes wore like a second garment. And perhaps there was some genuine rest in it too. Perhaps for a boy who had grown up under the open sky of Pelion, with a centaur for a teacher and the wind for company, there was something unexpectedly soft and nourishing about those palace rooms. The smell of oil lamps burning in the evening, the murmur of women's voices, the particular quality of safety that comes from being invisible inside a place where no one expects to find you. Among the daughters of Lycomedes, there was one named Deidameia, and it is said, though the telling varies, as it always does when it touches matters of the heart, that between Achilles and Deidameia something grew in those quiet rooms, something true and tender, its own kind of story running alongside the larger story that the world was assembling without his knowledge. Thetis watched the sea. She counted the days the way the sea counts them, without hurry, without hope of stopping them, simply marking their passage. She had done what she could do. She had bent the current as far as a mother's love can bend a current. The island was peaceful. The war was far away. The wind on Skyros in the late afternoons carries a quality of gentleness that is particular to islands that face west. It has already traveled a long way by the time it arrives, has passed over so much open water that all its roughness has been worn smooth, and it settles against the palace walls and the flowering terraces with something close to tenderness. For a little while, for the length of time that a little while lasts, which is never quite as long as we need it to be, the boy who would be Achilles was simply a young person on an island, breathing salt air, sitting in lamplight, learning how to be still. Let that stillness settle around you now, the way the evening settles over Skyros, slow and warm, and carried on a wind that has already forgotten whatever roughness it started with. There is more of this island to wander through yet, its courtyards and its sea light, its unhurried mornings, and that wandering can wait for you, patient as the tide. The light comes first, always the light. And on Skyros it arrives differently than anywhere else in the Aegean, softer somehow, thickened by salt and distance, spilling across the pale stone of the courtyards in long golden sheets that seem almost to have weight, almost to press warmly against the skin the way a hand might, gentle and unhurried, as if even the sun has learned the particular patience of this island. Skyros sits in the northern Aegean, like something the sea has been carrying for a long time, and finally set down with care, a small and unhurried island of white stone and olive silver, and the constant low conversation of waves against its rocky shores. It is not a place of great harbors or famous monuments, not in the way of other islands whose names echo through the old stories. It is quieter than that. rounder at its edges, worn smooth by centuries of wind and salt air into something that feels less like a place to arrive at and more like a place to be, slowly, without ambition, in the way of cats sleeping in warm corners and old men watching the water from the shade of fig trees. The palace of Lycomedes is not grand in the way that later ages would imagine palaces, not all cold marble and distant colonnades, but something more human-scaled and warm. Its stones the color of dry honey, its walls thick enough to hold the cool of early morning well into the heat of afternoon. The courtyards open one into another like the chambers of a shell, each one catching the light from a slightly different angle, so that moving through them over the course of a day is like watching time itself shift and soften and deepen. In the first courtyard there's a fig tree, old and gnarled at its base, whose branches have been trained along a low wall over many patient years, and in summer its leaves make a trembling canopy that throws the stones beneath into a moving, dappled shade. And the figs that ripen along its branches are dark and heavy and sweet in a way that feels almost indecent, almost too generous. The daughters of Lycomedes move through these spaces with an ease born of long familiarity, their footsteps quiet on the warm stone, their voices low and unhurried, rising occasionally into laughter that the walls catch and hold, and slowly release into the surrounding air. They are accustomed to their days here, to the rhythms of spinning and weaving, and the slow progress of embroidery, to the particular quality of afternoon light that falls across the loom and makes the threads glow like they have their own small interior fires. They are accustomed, too, by now, to the presence among them of the one who came to them some months ago, and who lives with them as a companion, who has a different quality to her stillness, a different way of holding the body when at rest, something contained and coiled and luminous that the young women have noticed without entirely being able to name. For here, among the women of Skyros, in the loose linen robes of a girl, moved Achilles, and if you let your attention settle and grow soft, if you release the image of the warrior and simply watch the young figure in the courtyard, you might find something unexpected, something almost touching, in the way the hero of the Iliad sits in the morning shade beside the others, learning the patience of the loom, letting the shuttle pass from hand to hand with a concentration that is not unlike the concentration of the hunt, precise and absorbed, and wholly present to the task at hand. It is said that the young Achilles was not entirely unhappy on Skyros. The story of a restless warrior chafing against his disguise is perhaps a later invention, something added to satisfy those who could not imagine a hero content in stillness. But the older threads of the tale suggest something more nuanced, more human. A young person who had grown up in the high forests of Pelion, far from other children, far from the particular warmth of human company gathered in close spaces, and who found, perhaps for the first time on Skyros, something that resembled ordinary life, with its small comforts and its daily repetitions, and the quiet pleasure of being known and welcomed among peers. The terraces that face the sea are the best places in the middle of the day, when the sun is at its height, and the light on the water has become almost too bright to look at directly, that particular Aegean white that seems to come from inside the surface, rather than from above it. There is always a breeze on the terraces, the kind that carries the smell of salt and something else beneath it, something mineral and clean, the smell of deep water. The young women bring their work here sometimes, or simply come to sit and watch the shifting colors of the sea, which changes from blue to green to gray and back again over the course of an afternoon, as though it cannot quite decide what it wants to be. Achilles, the story goes, was given a name among Lycomedes' daughters, Pyrrha, some say, for the reddish gold of the hair, which could pass for girlish even in the bright light of the Aegean afternoon. And sitting on those sea-facing terraces with that name and that light falling across the face, and the sound of the other women talking softly nearby, it is possible to imagine a version of the story in which the time on Skyros was a kind of grace, a pause before the great and consuming story began in earnest, a last long breath of something simpler. The evenings on Skyros are particularly beautiful, and this requires a moment to describe properly, because the quality of light at the end of the day here is one of those things that once seen, or in this case, once imagined, once held in the mind's quiet eye, does not easily leave again. The sun sets behind the hills of the island, rather than into the sea, which means the water to the east holds the last of the day's color long after the sun itself has gone, turning through gradations of amber and rose, and finally a deep, bruised violet that is not quite dark and not quite light, a color with no good name in any language, that simply is, briefly and completely, before the stars begin to come through. In that last light, the palace walls go warm and amber, and the fig tree in the first courtyard becomes a dark and intricate silhouette against the sky, and somewhere in the kitchens, the smell of wood smoke and olive oil and something savory and slow-cooked drifts through the evening air, and the day's work is done, and the women of Lycomedes gather in the inner rooms where the lamps are being lit one by one, small clay lamps filled with oil, their flames steady in the still interior air, throwing soft circles of gold onto the walls and the faces of those gathered near them. It is said that Achilles played the lyre on Skyros, as he had learned to play on Pelion under Chiron's patient teaching, and that the music he made in the evenings was of a different character than the warrior songs that would later be associated with his name, something slower and more searching, something that seemed to ask questions that had no answers, the kind of music that sits comfortably in the silences between its own notes, that does not demand or resolve, but simply continues, like breathing, like the sound of the sea below the terrace, like the small, steady burning of the lamps. And the sea is always there, always audible beneath everything else on this island, a low and constant presence, the sound of it changing with the wind and the hour, sometimes a gentle hushing, sometimes a deeper rhythmic percussion against the lower rocks, sometimes almost entirely still on windless nights, just a soft lapping, barely there, like the sound of something breathing very slowly in the dark. The months pass on Skyros in this way, gently, one into the next, the seasons turning in their mild Aegean fashion, the figs ripening and falling and the olive trees going silver in the autumn winds and the winter rains coming soft and frequent off the sea. The young women spin and weave and embroider and watch the water and talk in low voices in the lamplight evenings, and among them quietly, day by day, someone waits at the edge of a story that has not yet fully begun, and across the water, somewhere beyond the horizon that glows faintly violet in the last of the evening light, that story is beginning to take shape, beginning to gather its pieces, beginning to move in the slow, inevitable way of things that have already been decided by forces larger and older than any single life. But that movement, that gathering, is still far away tonight. Tonight, there is only the island, and the warm stone, and the fig tree's shadow on the wall, and the small flames of the lamps burning steadily in the still and fragrant air, and the sea breathing softly at the edges of the dark. The morning had come quietly to Skyros, as mornings always did on that island. The light arriving first at the water, spreading upward from the horizon in long pale sheets, touching the whitewashed walls and the fig trees and the stones of the courtyard before it reached the hills. The sea was calm. It was almost always calm at that hour before the wind found its direction, and the sound of it was little more than a long, soft breath against the lower rocks, unhurried, incurious, as though the Aegean had no particular interest in what the day might bring. And yet something was coming. Something had already left the mainland, already crossed the open water in a ship that moved with quiet intention through the early morning haze. The story goes that Odysseus of Ithaca had been thinking about the boy for some time, or rather that certain signs and certain prophecies had been placed before the gathered Greek commanders like pieces of a puzzle that could only be assembled one way. The ships were preparing at Aulis, the men were gathering from every corner of the Greek world, and there was a name that kept appearing in the council of seers, a name spoken with the particular weight that attaches to things both necessary and irreversible. Achilles, the son of Thetis, the boy said to be hidden somewhere, dressed in the clothing of a girl, living among the daughters of a king on an island that barely troubled the rest of the world with its existence. The war at Troy, it was said, could not be won without him, and so Odysseus, patient, watchful, fond of the kind of problems that rewarded cleverness over force, had sailed for Skyros. He arrived as a merchant. This is what the old stories tell us, and it has the ring of something Odysseus would do, because Odysseus rarely approached anything directly when an angle was available to him. He came with companions, and he came with goods, lengths of fine cloth, bronze ornaments, small luxuries from the mainland, and among those goods, arranged as though by accident or simple variety, he had placed a short sword and a spear, their blades catching the light with the particular brightness of new bronze, beautiful in the way that weapons can be beautiful when they are not yet understood as weapons. King Lycomedes received him with the ordinary hospitality that the age required. Guests were fed, conversation was made, and the household gathered with the mild curiosity that any visitor from the wider world brought to a place accustomed to its own quiet company. The daughters of Lycomedes came too, moving through the courtyard with the ease of those who had grown up there, dressed in their robes, comfortable and unhurried, and among them, taller than the others it is said, moving with a quality that cloth and custom could not quite contain, was the young person who called herself Pyrrha, who had golden hair, and who had lived here long enough that the rhythms of the island had softened her edges, had taught her to embroider and to carry water, and to sit in the evening with the other girls and listen to the small stories of an ordinary life. But there are things that cannot be entirely learned, and Achilles, for it was Achilles, as you have understood, had been shaped by something deeper than the habits of Skyros. He had been shaped by a mountain and a centaur. He had been shaped by years of running through pine forests before dawn, of learning the names of plants that healed and plants that hurt, of holding a lyre in fingers that had also learned to draw a bowstring, of being told again and again, in 1,000 different ways, that the world was wide and serious and worthy of his full attention. You can dress such a person in a girl's robes. You cannot entirely dress them out of what they are. It is said that Odysseus watched, that he was good at watching, patient in the way of a man who has always found observation more useful than announcement. He watched the daughters of Lycomedes examine the cloth he had spread out, the way their hands moved over the weave, the pleasure they took in color and texture. And he watched one of them, the tall one with the golden hair, look past the cloth almost immediately and let her eyes settle on the weapons lying at the edge of the display. Not with alarm, not with the startled discomfort that an object out of place might cause in someone who has never considered such things, but with a kind of recognition, the quiet attentiveness of someone reacquainting themselves with a language they have been trying to forget. The story has been told in various ways across the centuries. There are versions in which Odysseus arranged for a battle horn to be sounded suddenly in the courtyard, and all the women scattered in the natural response of people unaccustomed to the sound of military alarm, all except one, who turned toward it. There are versions in which it was simply the sword that revealed him, the way his hand went to it without thinking, the way he held it with an ease that was unmistakable. However it happened, and the old poets were never entirely in agreement on the precise moment, the result was the same. Achilles stood in the courtyard of King Lycomedes with a weapon in his hand, and the disguise had become something that neither of them needed to continue pretending to believe in. What passed between them in those first moments, the texts do not record in any detailed way, but it seems that Odysseus spoke plainly, once plainness became the only available language. He spoke of Troy. He spoke of the fleet assembling at Aulis, of the number of ships, of the names of the men who were going, names that Achilles would have known, some of them, from his mother's conversations, from the visitors who had passed through his life before Skyros, from whatever knowledge a boy carries in him of the larger world that is waiting for him. He spoke, it is said, of glory, that word which the Greeks wore like a second skin, which meant not precisely fame and not precisely honor, but something that encompassed both and extended beyond both into the realm of being genuinely and permanently remembered, of mattering in some way that outlasted the body. And Achilles listened. He was young, old enough for war, the Greeks would have said, which was not very old at all by the measure of any gentler age. He had been living in a suspended state, held in the amber of his mother's fear, and the disguise had perhaps felt comfortable enough, for a time, in the way that any safe and contained life can feel comfortable when you are not quite sure what the alternative looks like. But here was the alternative, speaking to him in plain sentences, in the voice of a man who had clearly already decided that Achilles would come. Thetis had known this moment would arrive. The story goes that she had wept for it already, in the deep way of those who have seen the future clearly and know that seeing it changes nothing. She had loved Peleus, and she had loved this boy, and she had known from the beginning that love was not strong enough to hold the fates still. There is something very human in that, in the knowledge that grief is coming, and the helplessness of that knowledge, and the continuing on regardless. She had done what she could. She had held the moment off as long as she could, and now the morning was here, the bright ordinary morning on Skyros, and her son was standing in a courtyard with a sword in his hand. He did not hesitate, the stories tell us. Or if he hesitated, it was only for a breath, the time it takes to turn away from one version of a life and toward another. He went to find his proper clothes. He sent word in whatever fashion the occasion required. He made his farewells to the daughters of Lycomedes and to the island that had kept him. And then, as the day moved toward its middle hours and the sea wind began to find its direction, the arrangements for departure were made. The water of the harbor caught the light as it always does on clear days. Small, shifting fragments of it, bright and restless, indifferent to the weight of what was being decided on the shore above it. The ship waited. Odysseus waited, with the particular patience of a man who had expected all along that the day would end this way. Somewhere across that water, beyond the line where sky and sea agreed to meet, the mainland was already loud with preparation. Aulis was filling. The beaches were crowded with timber and rope, and men from every island and every city that had pledged itself to the campaign. 1,000 plans were in motion, 1,000 fires already burning along the shore, and the great fleet was gathering itself, ship by ship, toward a crossing that no one living had made before. But that was still ahead. For now, there was only the harbor and the light on the water, and a young man stepping toward a ship that would carry him into the longest story the ancient world would tell about him. The water at Aulis did not move. It lay between the long arms of the Boeotian coast and the island of Euboea, like something poured and then forgotten, like oil left to settle in a shallow dish, and on its surface the reflections of 10,000 ships burned and shimmered and held perfectly still. You could stand at the water's edge in the early morning, when the mist had not yet lifted from the hills, and the air smelled of pine resin and salt and the damp wool of 10,000 sleeping men, and you could believe for a moment that you were looking at a painting rather than a living thing, that some great hand had set all of this in place, and then quietly removed the breath that would have made it real. Aulis was a narrow place, a channel between two shores, and in another age it might have been nothing at all, a fishing village, a stopover for merchant vessels carrying amphorae of wine from island to island across the blue Aegean. But in this age, in the long ago age when the story goes that the gods still kept one eye on the affairs of mortals and sometimes more than one eye, Aulis became the gathering place of the largest fleet the Greek world had ever seen or would ever see again. From Mycenae and Sparta, from Ithaca and Salamis, from Pylos on its rocky shore, and from Crete with its labyrinthine memory, from the island kingdoms and the inland valleys, and the mountain cities where smoke rose from altars every morning toward a sky that still listened, they came. They came with their black ships, their oar benches worn smooth, their bronze prows catching the early light, and they filled the channel at Aulis until there was barely room between one hull and the next, and a man might have walked, it is said, from one shore to the other on the decks of ships alone. The sound of it settled over you slowly, the way sounds do when there are so many of them layered together that they cease to be individual things and become instead a kind of weather. There was the low conversation of men, in dialects so varied that someone from the far coast of Thessaly might smile and nod at someone from Crete and understand perhaps one word in three. There was the rhythm of hammering, where ships were being caulked and repaired, the timber still fresh in some places, the smell of pitch rising warm and dark into the morning air. There was the sound of animals, oxen brought for sacrifice and for hauling, horses stabled on the higher ground behind the shore, and somewhere always the thin, clear voice of a pipe, one soldier or another passing the empty hours, with music in the old way, the way Chiron had once taught a certain boy on the slopes of a mountain far to the north. Achilles was among them. He had come from Skyros, drawn out from that quiet island life by Odysseus and his careful cleverness. And now he stood on this shore, in his own armor, his own name, his own extraordinary presence. And those who had not seen him before looked. They could not help but look. There was something about him that was difficult to name, something that sat between the human and something else, the way a flame sits between the wood that feeds it and the air that carries it away. He was young still, not yet 20 years by the reckoning the story gives us, and yet he moved through the camp at Aulis with the ease of someone who understood that the world had been arranged with a particular attention to the space he occupied within it. Not with arrogance exactly, more like the calm certainty of a river that knows its own direction. Beside him always was Patroclus, who was his cousin by some accounts and his closest companion by every account, and whose story will come to us in its own time, in its own gentle chapter. For now, it is enough to say that where Achilles was light, Patroclus was warmth, and together they moved through the long waiting days at Aulis with a quiet between them that needed no filling. And there was a great deal of waiting. This is perhaps the thing that no one who tells the story of Troy quite prepares you for. Not the battles or the losses or the long years of it, but the waiting. The fleet had assembled. The men had come from all their distant places, had said their farewells, had made their offerings and their promises, and then they had arrived at Aulis and found the water still and the wind absent, utterly and completely absent, as though someone had reached into the air above that narrow channel and removed the breath from it. The sails hung slack. The pennants on the mastheads did not stir. The smoke from the cooking fires rose straight up into a sky that seemed to be holding itself carefully, watching. Days passed and became weeks. The men who had come from the furthest places grew restless first, and then even the restlessness wore itself smooth and became something closer to a dull acceptance. There were games played on the shore, wrestling and racing, the throwing of the discus in the flat morning hours before the sun grew too high. There were dice games in the shade of the tents, and arguments that flared and subsided like small fires in green wood, and long hours simply sitting at the water's edge, with nothing to do but watch the still surface of the sea and let the mind drift. The kings and commanders gathered in the great tent of Agamemnon, who was the king of kings for this expedition, the one whose brother's wife had been taken, and whose anger had set all of this in motion. He was a large man, Agamemnon, broad across the shoulders and confident, in the way that men who have always had authority tend to be confident, not as a performance, but as a habit, as a resting posture. He sat at the center of these councils and spoke in the measured tones of someone who has learned that a king's voice must never rise above a certain register, lest it begin to sound like something other than certainty. And around him sat the others, Odysseus with his watchful eyes and his gift for saying the necessary thing in exactly the necessary way, Diomedes, who was brave in the straightforward manner of men who have never quite learned to fear, old Nestor, who could tell you a story about his youth for as long as you were willing to listen, and somewhat longer than that, and the others, the great names that would be sung for centuries on the other side of all that was coming. They watched the sky. They sent for the prophet Calchas, who was a man of thin build and careful manner, someone who seemed to be always listening for something just at the edge of hearing. And Calchas looked at the stillness of the water and the absence of the wind, and he told them what it meant and what would be required. The story goes that what he said in that tent changed things, quietly and irrevocably, in the way that certain words do. But the weight of that moment belongs to another telling, and it is not one we need to carry tonight. What we can rest with here, in the quiet of this chapter, is the image of the fleet itself, held in the mirror of the still water. 10,000 ships and more than 10,000 destinies gathered into that narrow channel between the coasts, all of them waiting together in the way that only large things can wait, slowly, heavily, with a patience that was not quite peace, but was not yet despair either. The mast tops caught the late sun and the rigging hummed very faintly, not from any wind but from the accumulated warmth of the long afternoon, the wood settling and breathing in the heat. The smell of salt and pitch was everywhere. Somewhere on the higher ground, a horse lifted its head and was quiet again. And at the water's edge, in the long gold of the evening, the reflections of the ships lay perfectly still, the way the sea at Aulis always lay, waiting for the story to move it, waiting for the breath that would fill the sails and carry all of this forward into what came next. For now, though, there was only the stillness and the soft voices of the men around their fires, and the Aegean holding everything in its flat and patient mirror. It is enough to rest here a while, on this shore, before the crossing. The wind will come when it comes. The sea had been restless for days. Even before the coast of Troy appeared on the horizon, you could feel it in the water, a kind of trembling in the deep currents, as though the Aegean itself understood what was coming and drew a long, slow breath before the moment arrived. The fleet moved in the early morning, when the sky was still the color of pale ash, and the stars had not yet fully released their hold on the darkness. Thousands of oars dipped and rose, and the sound of them across that wide water was like the breathing of some enormous living thing, steady and deep and unhurried, moving through a silence that felt older than memory. The ships had left Aulis behind, that strange, still harbor where the wind had finally come, where the fleet had finally gathered itself into motion after so many weeks of waiting. The story of Aulis, with all its weight and its sorrow, belonged to the past now, folded back into the water like a wave that has already broken on the shore. What lay ahead was the coast of Asia, the walls of a distant city, and the beginning of something that would take 10 years to finish and a generation to understand. Achilles stood near the prow of his ship. He was young still, perhaps 18 years, perhaps a little more, though the stories do not always agree on these particulars, and the wind came off the water and moved through his long hair, and he looked toward the horizon with the kind of stillness that very young people sometimes carry inside them when they have been told something enormous about their own life and have not yet decided what to do with the knowing. He had been told his fate. He understood in the way that a person understands something they have not yet fully felt, that if he went to Troy, he would not come home. His name would live forever, bright and clear and permanent as starlight, but the body that carried the name would be left in foreign soil. And yet here he was. Here was the prow of the ship, and here was the water, and here, slowly growing visible out of the morning haze, was the long, low shoreline of the Troad, the flat plain behind it, the dark smudge of distant hills, and somewhere beyond all of that, invisible still, the high walls of the city that had started everything. The sailors say, and it is said in some of the older accounts, that the first man to set foot on Trojan soil would be the first man to die in the war. Whether or not this is true in the way that histories are true, it was believed, and belief in those days had a weight and substance to it that we might struggle now to fully imagine. The gods were not distant then. They were present in the salt wind and the light on the water, and the dreams that came to men in the dark hours before dawn. To step from the ship onto unknown ground was to step into a story already being written by forces much larger than any single life. It is said that a young man named Patroclus was the first to leap from his ship onto the Trojan beach, and that he was cut down very quickly after, and that his name was remembered for this reason more than any other. But the stories of individual fates tend to blur at the edges in these early moments of the war, and what matters more perhaps is the image of it, that long stretch of pale shore, the ships grinding up onto the sand, the sound of oars shipped and hulls settling, and then the quiet before the noise of landing, that single-held breath when the world of the sea gave way to the world of the land, and everything changed. Achilles came ashore with the Myrmidons, his people, the soldiers he had brought from Phthia, compact and disciplined and loyal, in the way that men are loyal when they believe in their leader, not as a commander, but as something closer to a force of nature. They moved up the beach in the early light, and the sand was pale and fine beneath their feet, not so different from the beaches of home, and the sea behind them was the same Aegean they had always known, and yet everything was different. The air tasted different, the light fell differently, even the silence between sounds had a different quality here, across the water, on this side of the world. The plain of Troy extended away from the shore toward the distant city, broad and flat and threaded through with the silver glimmer of the river Scamander, a gentle winding river that moved through meadows of long grass and reflected the early sky back upward in long quiet ribbons of light. It was, in those first hours, a beautiful place. It is easy to forget that it was beautiful, knowing what it would become, but in the beginning, before the long years of war had worn it down, before the earth had been turned and turned again by men and horses and the grinding passage of armies, it was a soft and gentle landscape, the kind of place that in other circumstances a traveler might have wandered through in quiet pleasure, following the river downstream toward the sea. The Trojans were there, of course. They had watched the fleet approach from the high walls of their city, and they had come down to meet the landing. not in full force, but in enough numbers to remind the Greeks that this land was claimed, that these fields and this river and this shore belonged to people who intended to defend them. There was fighting on the beach that first day. The stories speak of it, though the details shift and change depending on who is telling them. And there was blood on the pale sand before the morning was fully established in the sky, and men learned very quickly what the next 10 years of their lives would feel like in the body, in the hands, in the space behind the ribs where fear lives. But in the way of very long wars, the first day was also in many ways like all the days that would follow, a push and a pull, an advance and a withdrawal. And then the gradual drawing apart of the two sides as the afternoon light deepened, and the exhaustion of the body began to make itself known. The Trojans withdrew toward their walls, the Greeks drew back toward their ships, and the plain between them, the wide, flat plain with its river and its grass and its particular quality of light in the late afternoon, was left empty and quiet, as if it too were resting, as if even the land needed time to absorb what had begun. The Greek camp began to take shape that evening. Ships were drawn up onto the beach, hulls resting on rollers of driftwood, prows turned back toward the sea, as though the ships themselves preferred to be ready for departure. Fires were lit against the cooling air, and the smell of wood smoke drifted down the shore and mixed with the salt smell of the water. And men who had been strangers to each other at the beginning of the day moved quietly through the unfamiliar routines of a camp that did not yet feel like home, but would, slowly, season by season, become as familiar as anything they had ever known. Achilles would have sat somewhere near his ships that first evening, among his myrmidons, among the crackling warmth of the fire, with the sound of the sea at his back, and the darkness of the Trojan plain before him. The city was invisible in the night, but its presence could be felt the way that anything large and immovable makes itself felt, even in darkness. A certain quality of weight and resistance in the air. Somewhere beyond that dark plain behind those walls, the people of Troy were also sitting by their fires, also listening to the night, also taking in what the day had meant. The stars came out above the Aegean, the same stars that had looked down on Pelion, on Skyros, on the long harbor at Aulis, on every shore Achilles had ever known. They moved in their slow, ancient courses across the sky, unhurried and indifferent, and somehow comforting in their permanence, and the sea beneath them made its low, continuous sound against the hull of every ship drawn up along that shore. The first day of a 10-year war had ended. The camp breathed and settled into its first night on foreign sand, and the firelight moved in the darkness, point after small and tender point of warmth, stretching all along the shore, as though the stars had come down to rest at the edge of the water, keeping watch over the sleeping soldiers in the soft, untroubled way that fires do when the fighting is done and the night is still and there is nothing left to do but let the body rest. The camp is quiet now. Let the sea do the rest of its work. In the days ahead, the tents will take on the smell of home, and the long rhythms of this strange new life will slowly settle into something recognizable, something that deserves its own unhurried time to be explored. The fire has been burning for a long time now. It began in the early evening, when the light along the Hellespont turned the color of old bronze, and someone laid dry driftwood across the embers from the night before, and the smoke rose thin and pale into the cooling sky, and by the time the stars had found their places overhead, the fire had settled into itself, steady and low, orange at its heart and red at its edges, casting a warmth that did not reach far, but reached far enough to touch the faces of the men sitting nearest, far enough to soften the outlines of the tents behind them, far enough to make the darkness beyond the camp feel gentle rather than threatening, a darkness full of sea sound rather than menace. This is where we rest tonight, in the long middle of things, in the encampment of the Achaeans on the shore of Troy. There are thousands of fires like this one, stretching in both directions along the beach, following the curve of the coast, the way a necklace follows the curve of a throat. Each one its own small world of warmth and voice and smell, and between them the darkness is not really darkness at all, but a soft gradation, a breathing amber-flecked half-light that makes the whole encampment feel like a single living thing, settling down into sleep. The ships are pulled up behind the camp, their dark hulls enormous and still, and the sea moves beyond them, with the patient indifference of something that has been moving since long before there were men to watch it. Its sound low and continuous and almost like breathing, almost like the sound the sleeping city makes when you stand at its edge in the small hours and listen. The smells of the camp come in layers, and if you sit very still and let your attention move through them the way attention moves through music, one note dissolving into the next, you find that each layer tells you something. There is salt first, always salt, the salt of the Aegean that has worked its way into every piece of cloth and leather and rope and skin within a mile of the water, so that even the bread has a faint mineral edge to it, even the wine. Beneath the salt there is wood smoke, the particular wood smoke of cooking fires that have been fed with whatever wood the foragers could find. Pine resin and olive wood and scrub oak, each burning at its own temperature, each giving the air its own particular note. And beneath the wood smoke there is something earthier, the smell of animals and men and worked leather, of barley soaking in a bronze bowl, of oil on metal, the smell of a place where many human lives are being lived in close proximity, which is not a pleasant smell exactly, but is a deeply human one, the smell of a community, of people enduring something together. The men who are still awake at this hour are not many. Some sit near the fires in small groups of 2 or 3, speaking quietly, not about anything important, the way men speak when they are tired and comfortable and not yet ready to sleep, about the taste of the wine tonight, whether it is better or worse than the batch before, about a horse that has been favoring its left foreleg, about a dream one of them had that he cannot quite remember but that left a particular feeling behind it, something like sadness, something like home. Some of the men are not speaking at all, simply sitting with their elbows on their knees and their eyes on the fire, watching the way the small flames move over the coals, which is one of the oldest things a person can do, and requires nothing, and gives something that is difficult to name, but that everyone who has sat by a fire at night recognizes, a particular quality of rest, of the mind releasing its grip on itself, of the present moment being, for once, sufficient. A dog moves through the firelight at the edge of one of the camps, pausing to smell something invisible in the trampled sand, then moving on, unhurried, belonging to everyone and no one. Somewhere to the left, slightly further up the beach, there is the sound of someone playing a stringed instrument very quietly, not performing but thinking aloud in music, a phrase repeated and then changed, and then repeated again, the way a person turns a worry over in their hands without quite resolving it. The sound travels a little way and then dissolves into the sea sound, which absorbs everything eventually, which takes the music and the low voices and the creak of the ships and the distant sound of a man coughing and holds them all in the same broad, unhurried rhythm. The tents are close together, each man knowing the smell and the snoring of his neighbor, each company of men arranged in their allotment of space with whatever order they have managed to impose on the perpetual disorder of long-term habitation. Things hang from tent poles, a cloak, a water skin, the salted remnant of a fish eaten days ago. Shields lean against the outer walls, their painted surfaces faded from sun and sea air. Spears are laid flat or propped in clusters. The accumulation of objects around any tent that has been occupied for a long time gives it a quality of habitation, of rootedness, that sits strangely against the temporary nature of the structure. The tent itself no more than cloth and rope and bena wood, the kind of thing that comes down in a morning and goes up again in an afternoon, and yet after enough mornings and afternoons spent beside the same tent, with the same men cooking the same food over the same kind of fire, the place becomes something more than a campsite. It becomes quietly a home, or at least the nearest available thing to one. The cooks have banked their larger fires by now, the great communal hearths where the evening meal was prepared, roasted meat that left fat dripping into the coals and rising as fragrant smoke, bread baked flat on heated stones, whatever the day's foraging had produced to supplement the stores. The eating is long finished. The bowls have been rinsed in water carried from the stream that runs down to the shore half a mile east of here, and they sit stacked or scattered in the firelight, the color of old clay. A man is asleep, with his head on his arm and his arm on his knee, tipped forward in the position of someone who meant only to rest for a moment and found that the moment was large enough to hold the rest of the night. No one has moved him. No one will. The stars are very bright above the plain of Troy, brighter than they are over most of the world, it seems, because the air here is so clear and so dry in the summer months, and there are no hills immediately to the east to break the vast open horizon over the land. The Milky Way lies across the sky like a length of pale cloth left out in the moonlight, and the individual stars, the ones with names, the ones the sailors used to steer by, burn with a steadiness that is almost solid, almost material, as if you could reach up and feel the heat of them on your palm. The men who are still awake sometimes look up, the way they have always looked up, finding in the sky the same thing the fire offers on a smaller scale, a place for the attention to rest, a constancy, something that does not demand anything in return for being looked at. The sea sound deepens as the night goes on. There is a particular quality to the water along this coast in the early hours, when the wind drops and the waves grow longer and slower, more like breathing than like restlessness, each one arriving at the shore with a sound like a long exhalation, and then the silence before the next one, and then the next one, and the rhythm of it is so close to the rhythm of sleep that it is almost impossible to sit near it and remain awake for long. Men who have spent enough nights here no longer need to think about sleeping. The sea thinks for them, and draws them down into rest with the patience and the gentleness of something that has been doing this since the world was new. The fire nearest to us burns on, lower now, its coals deep red in the darkness, its warmth reduced to something intimate, almost private. The faces of the sleeping men around it are quiet and young-looking, the way sleeping faces always are, all the day's calculation and wariness dissolved back into something simpler. The smoke rises, thin and straight tonight in the still air, up and up until it is indistinguishable from the darkness. And somewhere in the deeper part of the camp, in the company of the Myrmidons, where the tents are perhaps a little better ordered, and the firelight falls on armor that has been kept with particular care, there is a figure not yet sleeping, sitting with something held loosely in his hands, watching the same fire, listening to the same sea. But that is for another night to tell. For now, let the fire burn low, and let the sea say what the sea has always said, which is simply, rest. The cook fires had been burning for so long that the men had forgotten what it felt like not to smell smoke. It had become simply the scent of their lives, woven into their cloaks and their hair and the creases of their hands, rising each morning before the sun had fully cleared the dark ridge of the eastern hills, and drifting still through the pooling air long after the last ember had been banked for the night. If you had taken one of those men and carried him in sleep back to his home village on some green hill in Thessaly or Argos or the sandy plains near Pylos, he would have woken in the night reaching for something without knowing what it was, his body missing the particular language of a camp that never fully went quiet, never fully went dark. 9 years is a long time to be anywhere. It is long enough for a young man to become something older, more weathered, less certain of the things he was certain of when he first stepped from a ship onto foreign sand. It is long enough for the extraordinary to become ordinary, for the gleaming bronze of newly arrived ambition to take on the dull patina of routine. The war at Troy did not announce itself each morning as a war. Most mornings it announced itself as nothing more remarkable than another day. Bread to be baked from grain that was never quite fresh enough, water to be carried from the stream that ran behind the camp's eastern edge, leather to be mended, horses to be seen to, small arguments about nothing, small kindnesses about nothing, the endless and fundamentally human business of keeping a body alive and a mind occupied. The plain that stretched between the Greek encampment and the walls of Troy was a place that had its own slow grammar by now, familiar as a field behind a farmhouse. In spring, when the rains came off the water and the ground softened, a thin veil of green would push up through the churned and troubled earth, wild grasses finding the gaps between old tracks, small flowers that had no regard whatsoever for the fact that men had fought and bled in that same soil only weeks before. The Trojan horses grazed sometimes at the far edge of the plain in the early morning, too distant to pose a threat, close enough to be visible, and there was something in the sight of them, the easy, unhurried way they moved through the wet grass, that the Greek soldiers found oddly peaceful, almost companionable, as though even the enemy's horses had become part of the landscape they all shared. Summer on the plain of Troy was long and white and brutal. The sun climbed to a height that pressed down on everything with a flat, relentless weight, and the men who had to fight in it moved more slowly than they would have liked, the bronze of their helmets and breastplates drawing in the heat, until wearing armor felt like being sealed inside a cooking vessel. They learned to rest in the worst of it, to find the shadow of a tent wall, or the slight relief offered by the breeze that came off the sea in the early afternoon, carrying with it the smell of salt and open water. That was the closest thing most of them had to a reminder that the world beyond this narrow strip of coast still existed. They swam when they could. The Hellespont ran cold and fast to the north, and the sea was right there, always there, pulling gently at the shore with a sound like breathing, the sound of something enormous and patient and entirely indifferent to the affairs of men. There were skirmishes, of course, almost every week through those years, small engagements that flared and died on the margins of the plain or in the hills to the south, where the Trojans kept their allies and their supply lines. Men went out in the morning, and most of them came back by evening. And those who did not were mourned in the way that men in long campaigns learn to mourn, briefly, thoroughly, and then quietly set aside, because grief that lingers too long in a camp is a kind of illness that spreads. The heroes fought their greater battles, and the stories of those battles would eventually be told and retold until they hardened into legend. But in the living of them, they were simply events in a succession of events, frightening and consequential, and then over, folded into the larger texture of days. Achilles fought in those years with the kind of focused, almost meditative intensity that had marked him since childhood, the gift of Chiron still evident in the way he moved, the way he read the space around him, the way his spear left his hand as though it were an extension of thought rather than a physical action. The Trojans had learned to fear the sight of him on the plain. It is said that when the dust rose on the Greek left, and you could make out the particular gleam of his armor and the way he ran, there was a ripple of something through the Trojan lines, a collective tightening, a pulling back that was not quite retreat, but was not quite courage either. He was known. He had become, across 9 years, something almost mythological, even to men who were standing only a few hundred yards away from him, which is perhaps the strangest kind of fame, to be legendary to people who can see you clearly enough to count the dents in your shield. But away from the fighting, he was something else entirely, and it is that other Achilles who is most worth attending to as the years drifted past. He sat with Patroclus in the long evenings, and the two of them talked in the low, easy way of people who have long since said everything that needed to be said and are now simply enjoying the sound of a familiar voice in a familiar silence. He played the lyre, that beautiful instrument he had carried from Phthia with its silver pegs and the particular tone that those who heard it described as something between music and weather, something that seemed to belong to the atmosphere itself rather than to any human hand. The story goes that on still nights, the sound of it carried further than it should have, drifting over the camp in the dark and quieting men who heard it without their quite knowing why, setting down some small weight they had been carrying all day without realizing it. The seasons turned and turned again, and turned a third time and a fourth and a fifth, until the counting of them became imprecise, one summer blurring at its edges into the next. Men who had come as strangers became something closer than friends, the particular intimacy of people who have shared not just danger but tedium, not just battle, but the long suspended time between battles, the gray patient hours when there is nothing to do but exist in close proximity to other people and learn all the small, unglamorous details of who they actually are. Old grievances formed too, the slow accumulation of slights and injustices that any enclosed community generates over time, a residue that built in the joints of the camp's social life like sediment in a still pool. The men watched the walls of Troy across the plain, and the walls of Troy did not fall. They were old walls, immensely old, built, it is said, with divine assistance in some earlier age, and they had the patience of things that have stood through many seasons of human urgency. Behind them, the city continued its life, smoke rising from its own cook fires in the morning, the distant sound of cattle, and occasionally, if the wind was right, the far, faint sound of voices. There is something in the ancient sources that suggests the soldiers on both sides had come to regard this stalemate not with fury, but with something closer to resignation, a shared and unspoken understanding that this war had taken on a life of its own, beyond the intentions of any of the people caught inside it. And through it all, the sea was there. It was always there, indifferent and enormous and quietly beautiful in its way, shifting through every blue and gray and green the sky could suggest to it, rolling its long, slow waves up the shore and pulling them back again in the dark. The men who had trouble sleeping would walk down to the waterline sometimes, in the small hours, and stand there letting the sound of it fill up the inside of their heads, letting the smell of salt and deep water replace for a little while the smell of smoke and iron and too many people living too close together. They would stand until something in them settled, and then they would turn and walk back through the dark camp to whatever patch of ground served as their bed. The cook fires burned low in those hours, orange points scattered across the dark, and the camp breathed in its sleep, and the sea went on speaking in its old, unhurried language just beyond the edge of the shore. Something was building in those last slow months before the 10th year turned toward its ending. It had no shape yet, but it was there, the way a shift in the wind is there before you can name which direction it is coming from, present in the quality of the air, in the particular stillness that comes just before things change. But that is a story for the next quiet hour of this night, and for now there is only the camp, and the dark, and the low fire burning. There is a particular kind of stillness that gathers in a place where anger has been held too long, not the stillness of peace, but the stillness of water pressed behind a dam, a quietness that has weight and temperature and a faint low trembling at its edges. The encampment at Troy had known that stillness for some time before the morning everything finally broke open. And if you had walked through those long rows of tents in the pale hours before dawn, you might have felt it in the air the way you feel a change in the weather, a pressure behind the eyes, a salt-edged heaviness in the breeze that comes off the dark water of the Hellespont. 9 years is a long time to be away from home. 9 years is long enough for children to grow into strangers, for the memory of a wife's face to blur at the edges, for the smell of your own hearth to become something you reach for in dreams and cannot quite recover. The men of the Achaean army had given 9 years to this shore, 9 years of summers that baked the tents to leather, 9 years of winters that turned the plain of Troy to gray mud and set the bones aching. They had come as young men, many of them, with bright armor and bright expectations, and they had become something else entirely, weathered, patient, harder, quieter in ways that had nothing to do with peace. Achilles had given those years too, though he had given them differently from most. He had given them brilliantly, terribly, with a kind of brightness that set him apart from everything around him. The story goes that there was no city within reach of Troy that Achilles had not raided, no coastal town that had not felt the particular swift devastation of his presence. While the great army sat before the walls of Troy and waited and negotiated and waited again, Achilles had been in motion, had been the spearhead, had been the part of the Achaean enterprise that actually moved and struck and returned laden with the proof of it. He had done this not from obedience to Agamemnon, but because war was the element he had been shaped for, and because in motion he did not have to think too carefully about the choice he had made in coming here at all. Agamemnon, the great king, the lord of Mycenae, the commander of the assembled fleet of all the Achaean peoples, Agamemnon was a different kind of man entirely. He was a man of position and of weight, a man who understood power as something that must be seen to be real, who knew that the distance between a king and those beneath him must be maintained the way you maintain a fire in a cold place, with constant small attentions. He was not a simple man, and it would be unkind to reduce him to one, but he was a man for whom authority was not merely practical, but necessary in some deeper, more personal way, and when that authority was questioned or diminished, even obliquely, he felt it as a wound in a place that had been wounded before. The immediate cause of everything that followed was a woman named Chryseis, taken in one of those raids along the coast, brought into the camp as a prize and given to Agamemnon's tent. Her father, Chryseis, was a priest of Apollo, and he came to the beach with a suppliant's staff and a father's desperation, and he asked for her return, offering ransom, speaking with the formal dignity of a man who serves a god. Agamemnon sent him away. What followed was what tends to follow when the prayers of a priest of Apollo go unanswered. The god sent plague into the camp, a slow, terrible attrition that moved through the tents like a gray wind, day after day, the pyres burning on the beach, the smoke rising against the sky. It was Achilles who called the assembly. This matters, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. It was not Agamemnon who gathered the army to address what was happening to it, but Achilles, acting from something that was partly practicality and partly the particular impatience of a man who does not understand why obvious things are not done immediately. A seer named Calchas stood before the assembled warriors and spoke what he knew of the plague's cause. And he spoke it carefully, because he was a man who understood danger, and the danger in saying what he had to say was real. He said that the plague would not end until Chryses was returned to her father without ransom. He said this was the will of Apollo. He looked, it is said, at Achilles while he said it, as though Achilles' presence were a kind of protection. And then Agamemnon spoke, and what he said was true enough. He was being asked to give up something that had been awarded to him as a mark of honor, a visible sign of his status among the kings and warriors of the fleet. And to do so without equivalent return was to be seen as lesser, to have the shape of his authority altered in front of everyone who mattered. He would do it, he said, because he understood necessity. He would send the girl home, but he would have recompense. He looked across the assembly and his gaze settled on Achilles, and he said that he would take what was Achilles's. His prize was a woman named Briseis, taken from a city called Lyrnessus, and she had been given to Achilles by the army's formal judgment, the way prizes were given, as an acknowledgement of what he had done and what he was. For Agamemnon to take her was not, in the emotional logic of that world, merely an act of confiscation. It was a public statement about rank, about who had the power to diminish whom, about whether the greatest warrior of the army could be treated as a subordinate when the greatest king decided it was useful. What happened inside Achilles in that moment is described in the old stories with an image of extraordinary vividness. His hand moving to the hilt of his sword, the decision forming, and then something arresting it. It is said that only he could see the goddess Athena standing behind him, her hand on his shoulder, her voice quiet in his ear, urging restraint, and promising that what was taken would be returned threefold. Whether this is understood as a literal divine intervention, or as the felt experience of a man pulling himself back from an action whose consequences he can suddenly see clearly, either way, the sword stayed sheathed. But what came out of him instead was not silence, it was words, and the words were scorching and precise, and they named what Agamemnon was, in terms that cannot have been easy for anyone present to hear spoken aloud. And then they contained a promise, and the promise was this: when you need me, I will not be there. When the Trojans press you back to the ships, when there is no one left who can do what I can do, you will know what it cost you to dishonor me today. He withdrew. The word sounds almost peaceful, and in a certain light, a certain hour, a certain quality of evening silence settling over the camp. It was. He went back to his part of the shore, to his own ships, to the company of his myrmidons, to Patroclus, who was always there. He sat apart from the war that continued on the plain without him. And it is said that he went down to the edge of the water alone, to the place where the small waves moved in their slow repetition against the gray sand, and that he wept, not with fury, though the fury was there, but with something older and more complicated, a grief that had been gathering longer than the quarrel itself, a grief that touched the edges of everything he had chosen and everything he had not. The sea would have been the same as it always was, indifferent and enormous and beautiful, its surface shifting in the late afternoon light, its smell carrying everything it always carries, salt, distance, the cold memory of depths that no fire can warm. And perhaps in the rhythm of those small waves, endlessly arriving and endlessly returning, there was something almost restful, if not quite peaceful. The world continuing in its ancient motions, patient beyond all human urgency, unhurried by the anger of even the greatest of heroes. He sat by the water, and the camp went on without him, and the smoke of the evening fires drifted up into the darkening sky, and somewhere beyond the walls of Troy, the city continued its own long vigil, not yet knowing what the withdrawal of one man from a foreign army would eventually mean for everyone. Tonight, let those fires dim. Let the voices settle. The shore is quiet now, and somewhere farther down the beach in the firelight of a tent, 3 men are about to rise and walk toward Achilles with words they hope will be enough. But that is for another night. For now, the sea moves gently at the edge of everything, and the stars are beginning, one by one, to appear. The fire had been burning for some time already when they came. 3 figures moving through the darkness of the camp, their sandals quiet on the packed earth between the rows of tents, the smell of wood smoke and salt air wrapping around them as they walked. You can imagine the night itself holding still for a moment, the way nights sometimes do along that shore, when the sea withdraws its murmuring just enough to let silence take a turn, and the stars above the Aegean press down close and bright as scattered embers. It was into this kind of night that Odysseus walked, and great Ajax beside him, and the old man Phoenix, who had known Achilles longer than either of them, who had held the boy on his knee and taught him the names of things when the world was still new and the war was not yet even a dream. They had been sent by Agamemnon, though that name perhaps sat uneasily on all their tongues as they walked, because what they carried was not quite an apology, and not quite a plea, but something in between, an offering of gifts, of gold and horses and women, of kingdoms promised and honors restored, all of it piled up in the language of negotiation like stones arranged to dam a river. Agamemnon had named his terms carefully, and the 3 men had listened carefully, and now they walked through the soft dark of the encampment toward the part of the shore where Achilles had drawn his ships and his men and his silence apart from everyone else, separated by distance and by something that had no easy name. The tent of Achilles stood close to the sea. It is said that he had chosen this place deliberately, whether for the sound of the water or for the ease of departure. No one could say with certainty, but there was something fitting about it. The greatest of the Greeks encamped at the very edge of the world he was refusing, with the dark water at his back and the plain of Troy somewhere ahead in the darkness beyond the fires. A soft light came from within the tent, warm and unsteady, and as they drew close, the 3 men heard something that perhaps none of them had expected. They heard music, the gentle plucking of a lyre, slow and unhurried, the notes falling into the night air like leaves drifting down to still water, one after another, without urgency, without any of the fury that the rest of the camp had been bracing for since the day Achilles had turned away from the war. They found him sitting with the instrument in his hands, Patroclus quiet nearby, the firelight laying its amber warmth across both of them, across the curve of the lyre and the downturned face of the man playing it. Achilles looked up when they entered, and the story goes that he rose at once, with what appeared to be genuine pleasure, and welcomed them in, setting down the lyre, calling for wine and food, doing everything that the old customs of hospitality required, the ancient codes of guest friendship that existed even in the middle of war, perhaps especially in the middle of war, because those codes were among the things that kept the world from dissolving entirely into violence. So they ate together, and they drank, and for a little while the tent felt like something removed from the conflict altogether, a pocket of warmth and shared history. Old friends who had come a very long way from home, and who remembered all of them, what the world had felt like before all of this began. Phoenix had been with Achilles since childhood, had traveled with the boy from the mountain slopes of Pelion to the shores of Aulis, and then across the water to this long, exhausting war. Ajax had fought beside him in the field, had felt the confidence that ran through the Greek ranks whenever Achilles was near, had also felt its absence like a cold wind these past days. And Odysseus, clever, watchful Odysseus, had chosen his words with the greatest care, shaping them during the walk over as a craftsman shapes wood, knowing that he was not dealing with an ordinary man, and that ordinary arguments would not serve. And so Odysseus spoke, and he laid out the gifts that Agamemnon offered, one by one, in full, letting them accumulate in the firelit air of the tent. 7 bronze tripods, 10 talents of gold, 20 bright cauldrons, 12 swift horses, 7 women of Lesbos, and Briseis returned untouched, and cities besides, and his choice of Agamemnon's daughters in marriage, and more besides. He listed them carefully and patiently, because the gifts were generous by any measure, genuinely generous, and Odysseus was good enough at reading people to know that the scale of the offer was itself a message, a form of admission that what had been done was wrong. Achilles heard all of it. He sat with his hands loose in his lap, the firelight moving across his face, and he did not interrupt. He was not angry in the way that those outside the tent had perhaps imagined him, not pacing, not thundering, not burning with the visible heat of a man who might be turned back toward battle if only the right words were found. He was, instead, very still, and when Odysseus finished, Achilles spoke with a quietness that was, in its own way, more absolute than any rage. He said that he had weighed everything, that he had spent these days in his tent, not in idleness, but in the long, difficult work of thinking, and that what he had come to understand was something he could not undo by accepting gold. He spoke of the two fates that his mother had told him of, the one where he stayed and fought, and died young but gloriously, and the one where he left, and went home and lived long and quietly, and was forgotten. He spoke of this choice not with bitterness, but with the kind of exhausted clarity that comes to a person who has looked at something very hard for a very long time, and finally stopped flinching. He said that no treasure was worth a life, that gates of Hades hold equally the man who has done everything and the man who has done nothing, and that he had decided he would rather go home. He would sail at dawn, he said, if the weather allowed, and he invited them, gently, without hostility, to consider doing the same. It is said that the tent was quiet for a long time after that. The fire shifted and settled. The sea breathed against the shore outside. Old Phoenix spoke next, and his voice, the story goes, was thick with something beyond argument. Not strategy, not rhetoric, but the plain grief of a man who had loved the boy, who was now this unreachable man, who had carried Achilles as a child, and watched him grow, and followed him to war, and now sat in a lamplit tent watching him choose to leave. Phoenix spoke of the old stories, of heroes who had relented, of the goddess of prayer who follows behind ruin, trying to undo the damage, and his words were beautiful, and true, and full of love, and Achilles heard all of them with the same still attention he had given to Odysseus. And he thanked Phoenix. He said that Phoenix was as dear to him as a father, and that he was welcome to stay, to sleep here tonight, and to sail home with him in the morning, if he chose. He said this tenderly. He meant it. And that tenderness was, in its own way, a kind of answer, because it showed that the refusal was not coldness, was not indifference to the people around him, but was something else entirely, a grief that had gone so deep it had quieted everything else, a withdrawal not into anger, but into something beyond anger, into the private country of a man who no longer believes the story he has been living. He spoke briefly, plainly, soldier to soldier, and said that there were men who needed him, and that seemed to be all he had. And Achilles said to Ajax that he had spoken rightly, and that he felt the truth of it, but that the wound was still too raw, and that until Agamemnon's offense was answered in the blood of battle, until the fire of the Trojans reached his own ships on this very shore, he would not return. So they left. 3 men walking back through the darkness, the fire growing smaller behind them, the sounds of the tamp coming up around them again, the low voices, the distant creak of rigging, the eternal patient breath of the sea. And behind them, in the tent by the water, Achilles reached again for his lyre, and the slow notes found their way out into the night, one at a time, unhurried, like something searching for a shape it has not yet found. Patroclus stayed close. The fire burned lower. The shore held its long, quiet watch, and in that firelit stillness, in the space between the music and the sea, there was something waiting, not a conflict, not yet, but the slow deepening of a story that was not finished, and at the center of it, the one friendship that held Achilles more surely than any oath, more closely than any armor, more tenderly than anything the gods had given him or the war had yet taken away. The cook fires have burned low across the camp tonight, and the men who tend them have grown quiet, and somewhere far along the shore, the sea is moving in its slow, unhurried way, pulling back from the dark sand and returning again the way it has always done, the way it will long after all these names have passed into the softness of legend. And it is in this quietness, in this hour when the camp breathes slowly and the stars have settled into their places above the Aegean, that we might turn our attention not to battles or to gods or to the great grinding machinery of fate, but to something smaller and warmer and more essential than any of those things, to the space between two people who have known each other so long that knowing itself has become something like breathing, automatic and necessary and barely noticed until it is gone. Patroclus came into Achilles' life before either of them had any proper understanding of what life was. The story goes that Patroclus was not born to greatness in the way Achilles was, not carried into the world wrapped in divine prophecy, not the son of a goddess or the subject of heavenly argument. He was the son of Meadow, a king of modest means and quieter reputation, and he grew up in the ordinary way of noble boys in those times, learning the weight of a spear, the management of horses, the long patient art of waiting for instruction to become instinct. He was older than Achilles by some years, it is said, though the sources that have come down to us disagree on the precise count, and perhaps it does not matter so much as the texture of what that small difference meant between them. A certain ease of manner in Patroclus, a quality of steadiness that the brilliant and restless Achilles seemed to find both calming and magnetic. What is said to have brought Patroclus to the house of Peleus, to the shoreside palace where the young Achilles was growing into the strange and luminous creature that he was, is one of those stories that carries the particular sadness of childhood. The story goes that Patroclus, still young, killed another boy in an argument over a game of dice, the kind of accident that happens in an instant and cannot be taken back, and that his father sent him away for his own safety to be raised in the household of Peleus, far from those who might wish him harm. It is the kind of beginning that does not seem on its surface like the foundation of anything beautiful. And yet, Peleus received him, as the great heroes of that age were said to receive those who came to them in need, with the open hand of hospitality, and Patroclus became part of the household, became part of the daily life of that place, and somewhere in the ordinary accumulation of shared mornings and shared meals and shared hours of practice in the courtyard, he and Achilles found each other. You can imagine it, perhaps, in the way these things happen in childhood. Not with the sudden recognition that the old stories sometimes describe, not with any dramatic moment of revelation, but with the slow and unremarkable settling of one person into another person's life, like silt settling to the bottom of still water, quiet and gradual, and eventually so complete that the water cannot be imagined without it. They would have trained together, run together, sat together in the long evenings when the fire was banked and the palace grew soft with shadow, and Achilles, who burned so brightly and so restlessly, would have found in Patroclus something he found almost nowhere else, a kind of steady, undemanding presence that did not require him to be anything other than what he was, because Achilles was difficult to love in the way that all extraordinary things are difficult to love. He was too much, too fast, too fierce, too beautiful, too certain of himself in some moments, and too tormented in others, capable of a warmth so intense it was almost uncomfortable to stand near, and a coldness just as absolute when he withdrew it. The gods who watched him from Olympus saw in him their own excesses reflected back at them, and the men around him in the Greek camp at Troy had learned, over 9 long years, to give him a certain careful space. He was admired, he was feared, he was rarely understood. Patroclus understood him, not in the way of someone who has studied a subject carefully from a distance, but in the way of someone who has simply been present, long enough and close enough that understanding has ceased to be a conscious activity. He knew when Achilles needed to be spoken to and when he needed silence. He knew the difference between the withdrawal that meant fury and the withdrawal that meant grief. He knew how to sit beside him without asking anything, how to offer comfort without framing it as comfort, how to be there in all the unnoticed ways that constitute the deepest form of care. And Achilles, for his part, loved Patroclus with the whole undivided force of a nature that did nothing by halves. The ancient poets who told their stories did not always name what that love was, or named it in ways that have shifted in meaning across the long centuries between their world and ours. What we can say, gently and with some confidence, is that in the world Achilles and Patroclus inhabited, there were forms of love between men, between warriors, between companions, between those who had grown up together and fought together and learned together, that carried a weight and a tenderness that we might now reach for other words to describe. The story goes, in some of the traditions that have come down to us, that theirs was a love of the deepest kind, not easily sorted into categories, not requiring such sorting. It was, in the simplest and most complete sense of the word, the central relationship of both their lives. They shared a tent in the Greek encampment, it is said, and shared their fire, and in the evenings when the fighting was done and the camp had settled into its rhythms of cooking and complaint and the low murmur of exhausted men, it is said that Achilles played the lyre, that beautiful instrument he had carried with him from the halls of Chiron on Pelion, and Patroclus sat and listened, and the music moved between them like a third presence, warm and wordless. Think of that for a moment. 9 years of evenings, 9 years of the same fire, the same music, the same companionable darkness outside the tent walls, the same sea sound coming in across the plain. In all the long catalogue of the Trojan War, with its thousands of ships and its epic geography of blood and ambition, there is something almost unbearably tender in that image. Two men, sitting by firelight, one playing, one listening. The war paused for an hour at the edge of the known world. When Achilles withdrew from battle after the quarrel with Agamemnon, when he pulled his men back to the ships and refused to fight, it was not in isolation that he withdrew. Patroclus withdrew with him, or rather, Patroclus simply went where Achilles went, as he always had, as naturally as one's shadow follows along the same ground. He sat with Achilles through those strange, suspended days of the withdrawal, days when the Greek army suffered and lost ground, and the sounds of distant fighting drifted over the sand. And it is said that Patroclus watched the suffering of his friends and countrymen with increasing anguish, that his generous heart found the position of careful inaction harder to bear than Achilles did, because Patroclus was gentle, in the way that truly courageous people sometimes are, gentle not as a limitation, but as a form of strength, as evidence of a nature large enough to hold other people's pain without deflecting it. The ancient sources describe him as kind, as the word that comes most readily when his companions speak of him. Not the brilliance of Achilles, not the cunning of Odysseus, not the eloquence of Nestor. Kindness. And in a world as brutal and beautiful as the world of Troy, that quality was not a small thing. He sits tonight in the half-dark of the tent, close to the fire, close to Achilles, the sea coming in and going out beyond the camp walls with its old and patient sound, and neither of them speaks, and the silence is not empty but full of the long history of two lives grown so intertwined that the boundary between them has become something comfortable and blurred, like the place where firelight gives way to shadow, imprecise and warm. Soon, the armor will be lifted down from its place. Soon, the morning will come with its new and irreversible decisions. But not yet. Tonight the fire is still burning, and the sea is still breathing, and the two of them are still here together, in the last of the quiet hours, and it is enough, for now, simply to rest in that. The morning arrived without announcement, the way mornings in that long war often did, a slow graying of the eastern sky above the Trojan plain. The stars not so much disappearing as simply forgetting to shine, one by one, until the whole vast canopy had softened into the pale, washed color of old linen. The fires of the Greek encampment had burned low through the night, and the sea behind the ships lay still, almost glassy, reflecting nothing yet, waiting for the light to tell it what color to be. Achilles had not slept, or perhaps he had, in the shallow way of those whose grief sits close to the surface of consciousness, rising and falling with the breath, never quite releasing its hold. He had been sitting at the entrance to his shelter, or standing at the waterline, or simply existing somewhere in the space between those two places, and the hours had passed around him the way water passes around a stone, shaping themselves to his stillness, moving on without carrying him anywhere. Patroclus had been watching him for days now. This is worth understanding gently, if you are still with me here in the dark. The watching of a friend who knows that the one he loves is disappearing, not into death or distance, but into something almost worse, a kind of willed removal from the world that wears the shape of life, while practicing the motions of leaving it. Achilles sat. Achilles ate very little. Achilles looked out across the plain toward the city he had once been so eager to reach, and his face held nothing that resembled the expression of a man who wished to go there now. But the war had not waited. Wars never do, and this one in particular seemed to press forward with a kind of blind momentum, indifferent to the moods of even its greatest soldier. The Trojans under Hector had been pushing hard against the Greek ships, and the sounds of battle had grown closer, louder, more insistent. The clash of bronze arriving on the salt air with the smell of smoke, the distant rising and falling of voices that could have been, if you did not listen carefully, the sound of a very large and unhappy sea. Patroclus came to Achilles in the early morning with his eyes already full of what he was about to say. He had been watching the battle from the edge of the camp, and what he had seen had moved in him the way that sorrow moves through a person who has run out of ways to hold it quietly inside. He spoke of the Achaeans being pressed back, of ships threatened, of men he knew falling on ground that should never have been given up. He spoke with the particular anguish of someone who has both the skill to help and the circumstances that prevent him from doing so. And then he asked, "Let me go," he said, or something that meant this, in whatever words passed between them in that place and that time, in the tongue of a world so old that even its silence has a different texture than the silence we know. "Let me take your armor," he said, "and the men will believe that you have returned, and perhaps the Trojans will lose the heart they have been siding with, and perhaps the ships can be saved, and perhaps the word that held the most weight, the one that cost him most to say, perhaps you yourself will find it easier to return once you see what the battle looks like again from the outside, once you see that the world still needs what you are." Achilles was quiet for a long time after this. The sea moved behind him, very softly, with the small rhythmic persistence it had maintained all through the war, all through his childhood, all through the years of his becoming. Always there, always the same note beneath whatever else was sounding, the salt silver constancy of it, like a thread running through the whole of his life. The story goes that he set conditions, that he told Patroclus to drive the Trojans from the ships and no further, not to push on toward the walls of Troy itself, not to seek Hector, not to reach for the deeper glories that might call to a man wearing the armor of Achilles. He said this clearly, it is said, with the careful emphasis of someone who understands that the armor carries a kind of gravity, a pull toward great deeds that could override the intentions of whoever wore it. He said, "Be careful." He said, "Come back." And then the armor was brought out, and the light caught it. There is no adequate way to describe what that armor was, even in the slow and careful language of old stories. It had been made, the tales all agree, by the god of the forge himself, hammered from metals that do not exist in ordinary mountains, designed with a craft that exceeds what mortal hands could manage working alone. It had been on Achilles since before Troy, since before the fleet had gathered at Aulis, since before the war was anything more than a slow gathering of obligation. It had become over those 9 years less a piece of equipment and more a second skin, the bright outer surface of what Achilles was in the world's eyes, the gleaming signal that meant the most dangerous man on the plain had arrived. When Patroclus put it on, something shifted. The men who gathered to watch stood straighter. The morning seemed to clarify, and Patroclus himself, beloved, gentle, careful Patroclus, who had spent years being the quieter presence beside the blazing one, seemed for a moment to become something larger, something carried forward by the weight and the brightness of what he now wore. He mounted the chariot. The horses, those extraordinary horses who were themselves, it is said, gifts from gods, and who sometimes behaved as though they understood more than horses should, stood with a dignity that made the moment feel already old, already memorable, already part of the past even as it was beginning. They went, and Achilles stayed. This is the part of the story that settles most heavily in the chest, if you think about it slowly enough to feel its full shape. Not the going, but the staying. Achilles stood at the edge of the encampment and watched the chariot move toward the noise and smoke of the battle. Watched the armor he had worn for a decade catching the light on someone else's shoulders. Watched the space where Patroclus had been a moment ago become simply space. And then he turned, and the camp was around him, and the sea was behind him, and he was alone in the particular way that is not about the absence of other people, but about the presence of a choice that cannot be unmade. He climbed, it is sometimes told, to a place where he could see the plain, not to watch, perhaps, not with any eagerness, but because the eyes go where the heart is, even when the heart is telling them not to. And so he would have stood somewhere above the line of ships, above the gulls who moved along the waterline with their slow and self-absorbed competence, above the smell of wood and rope and brine, and looked out across the wide, dry, light-filled distance toward Troy. The smoke of battle rose in the still air in the way that smoke does when there is no wind to scatter it, straight up for a while, then spreading in a slow and horizontal fan, like the memory of something that was once moving. He could see, or perhaps only imagine he could see, the glint of bronze in the distance, the movement of formations, the general confusion of a battle viewed from too far away to make sense of. He could hear the sounds arriving late and softened by distance, stripped of their individual meanings, blurred into that general low roar that is the voice of war when you are not inside it. He waited. The sun moved across the sky with the patience it always had, the patience that had nothing to do with what happened beneath it, the patience that would continue long after this war and every war that came after it had finished and been forgotten. The sea moved behind him, the smoke moved in front of him, and Achilles stood between these two motions, still watching, carrying in his chest the particular quality of dread that belongs not to the one who goes into danger, but to the one who watches someone they love disappear into it. The day would pass as days do. The light would change, the sounds from the plain would shift in their character and quality, and somewhere in that shifting, somewhere in the long afternoon stillness, before the news arrived to shatter it, Achilles waited on the shore with the sea at his back and the war in front of him, and the space where Patroclus had been, still carrying its particular, unbearable warmth. Rest now if you can. The shore is there, the water moves, there is more to hold gently and quietly in the chapter that comes next. But for now, let the sound of the sea find you where you are, and let the day grow soft. The afternoon light had gone strange over the water. It happens sometimes along that coast, even now, a quality of stillness that arrives without announcement, a flattening of the sea's surface so that it holds the sky like a mirror holds a face, perfectly and without comment. The gulls had quieted. The small sounds of the encampment, the ring of a hammer somewhere distant, the low conversation of men near their fires, the creak of rope against timber where the ships rested on the beach, all of it seemed to have drawn back, as though the world itself had taken a slow breath inward and was holding it, waiting for something it already knew was coming. Achilles was sitting near the water when Antilochus found him. He had been there for some time, it is said, simply watching the Aegean move in its unhurried way, the low swells lifting and settling, the way they always had and always would, regardless of anything that men chose to do upon the thin rim of shore between the sea and the wide plain of Troy. He had not gone into battle that day. He had remained apart, as he had remained apart for weeks now, and the morning had passed quietly around him, and the afternoon had come, and the light had changed, and now Antilochus was standing a little way off, with his face arranged into an expression that no young man should ever have to wear, the face of someone carrying a weight they have not yet found a way to set down. There are moments that exist outside of time, not before them, not after them, but the moments themselves. They do not move in the ordinary way that moments move. What happened in the space between Antilochus opening his mouth and the words arriving in the air between them was one of those moments. The sea kept moving, the sky kept holding its pale late afternoon color, and then the words were said, and the world that had been the world a breath before became something else entirely, something with a different shape, a shape that would never fully return to what it had been. Patroclus was dead. It is worth staying here for a little while, in this place just after those words, because it is easy when we tell the old stories to move quickly past the grief toward what the grief produces, the rage, the armor, the return to battle, the great and terrible things that follow. But grief itself is not a prelude. It does not exist in service of what comes after it. It exists fully and completely in its own right. And what settled over Achilles in those first moments on the shore of Troy was not the beginning of something else. It was its own vast and entire thing. He had known, in the way that people sometimes know things before they know them, that the smoke rising over the distant part of the field had carried something wrong in it. He had watched it all afternoon without moving, the dark column bending slightly where a wind caught it, and something in the watching had been different from the ordinary watching of a man who is simply waiting. Something had pulled at him from the direction of that smoke, some thread he could not name, and he had sat with it, and let the afternoon pass, and had not gone to look, because, and perhaps this is the thing that lives at the very center of this story, because as long as he did not know, the thing he feared had not yet happened, and Antilochus was standing before him with his young face arranged in that terrible expression, and the words had been said, and the knowing had arrived. What Homer tells us, and Homer who lived so many centuries after these events, that he is himself half legend, who gathered the old songs and breathed his own breath into them. What Homer tells us is that Achilles took the dark dust of the earth in both his hands and poured it over his head, and that he cried out, and that the women of his household, the captive women who had lived alongside both men and who knew Patroclus as the gentler of the two, came running at the sound and cried with him. And that Thetis heard her son's grief from wherever she moved beneath the sea and rose toward him through the water. But before all of that, before the dust, before the sound that brought the women, before his mother rose from the deep, there was a moment of absolute stillness. This is the part that the old poems move through quickly because it has no action in it, because nothing happens, because it is simply a man sitting on a beach in the knowledge that the person most central to his life is no longer in the world. Patroclus, who had grown up beside him, Patroclus, who had come with him from Thea, who had sat with him through 9 years of this war, who had shared his tent and his fire, and the long evenings when there was nothing to do but eat and talk, and play the lyre, and wait for another morning to come. Patroclus, who had been gentle in ways that Achilles was not always gentle, who had tended the wounded men of the camp, who had argued with him patiently and without fear, who had known exactly how to sit with him in silence when silence was what was needed, and how to speak when speaking was what was needed. Patroclus, who wore his face in Achilles' memory at every age, the boy he had been at Thea, the young man on the ships, the man he had become in the long, slow middle years of this war, beside the Aegean. The sea moved. It did not know. It had no knowledge of what had happened on the plain, and no interest in the grief of one man on its shore. It had been moving before Achilles was born, and it would be moving long after every person who had stood upon that beach had dissolved back into the earth. And in this indifference, there was something that was not cruel, but simply vast, simply the size of the world, against the size of one human heart trying to hold what it could not hold. Thetis rose from the water. It is said that her sisters, the Nereids, rose with her, all of them moving up through the depths together, the pale shapes of sea-nymphs surfacing in the late light, gathering on the shore around her son, and she held him. This is the image that stays, the goddess mother holding her mortal son on the gray edge of the sea, as they had always known that this was the shape of the life she had given him. She had tried to change it. She had dipped him in the river. She had hidden him on Skyros. She had bargained and grieved and warned. And still the war had come for him, and the war had taken Patroclus first, which was perhaps the cruelest way for it to arrive. She did not try to comfort him with the distance of a goddess. She sat with him in his grief, the way a mother sits, not above it, not explaining it, but beside it, holding it with him, because she was the only one who loved him in the particular way that she loved him, and because there was nothing else to offer, and she knew it. The fires of the camp came alive one by one as the darkness gathered from the east. The sea went from pale gold to gray to a deep and lightless blue, and somewhere out beyond the sight of shore it was already night. The dark water moving in the old rhythm it had kept since before anyone had given it a name. The smell of salt hung over everything, and wood smoke from the cooking fires, and the particular cool of an Aegean evening coming in off the water. Achilles sat on the shore, and his mother sat beside him, and the night came, and the grief did not lift but only settled more completely around him, the way water settles into sand, finding every hollow, reaching every place. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. The war would ask something enormous of him, and he would answer it, and the long-faded current that had been moving beneath the whole of his life would carry him forward, toward what it had always been carrying him toward. But that was tomorrow, and tomorrow was not yet here. Tonight there was only the shore, and the darkness over the water, and the soft sound of the sea breathing against the sand, unhurried, ancient, indifferent, and somehow, in its very indifference, deeply, quietly kind. The plain of Troy lay quiet in the hour before dawn, the way a held breath is quiet, the way water is quiet just before it begins to move. Cook fires had burned down to their orange eyes across both camps, and the sentries on the walls of the city stood wrapped in their cloaks, looking out over a darkness that seemed, for just those few hours, to hold everything still. The sea behind the Greek ships made its endless low sound against the shore, that same salt-breathing rhythm that had accompanied every night of this long war, patient and indifferent and always there, like a thread woven through every moment since the fleet had first crossed the gray water and touched this foreign sand. And then the morning came, and with it Achilles. He had not slept. Those who saw him in the early light said afterward that he seemed to have moved past the ordinary needs of the body, past hunger and rest and the small hesitations that slow ordinary men. His new armor caught the first pale light of the sun, armor that Hephaestus himself had forged at the weeping request of Thetis, his mother, who had risen from the sea to bring it to her son. The shield was enormous and elaborately made, it is said, worked with images of the whole world, cities and harvests and rivers and the turning stars, as though the god of the forge had wanted to give this mortal boy the entire earth to carry before him into his last great acts. The breastplate gleamed like a second sun, the greaves were bright as water, and Achilles himself moved through the early morning camp like something that had come back from a place slightly beyond reach, his grief so large it had burned clean through ordinary feeling and come out the other side as a kind of terrible, luminous purpose. The Greek soldiers who had suffered through the weeks of his absence, who had been driven back to the ships and nearly broken, came out of their tents in their sleep to watch him pass. They did not cheer at first. They only looked. There was something in the way he walked that silenced ordinary celebration, something that said this was not a soldier returning to a fight, but a force returning to its proper place in the world, the way a tide returns not with noise, but with absolute inevitability. He harnessed his immortal horses, Xanthus and Peleus, those strange and beautiful animals who were themselves the children of the west wind, it is said, gifted once to his father Peleus. The story goes that Xanthus, moved by some divine permission in that strange morning, turned his long head and spoke to his master, and said that Achilles would return alive from this day's battle, but that the day of his death was already close, already written in the fabric of things, and that no horse and no armor and no god could change it. Achilles listened. He had known since the morning he learned of Patroclus, known with a certainty that sat not in his mind, but somewhere deeper, in the still place below thought, where truth lives when it has been fully accepted. He thanked the horse, it is said, and picked up his spear, the great ash spear from Mount Pelion that only he had ever been strong enough to use, and he walked forward into the day. What followed on the plain of Troy was not glory in any simple sense, though the poets would make it glorious, would make it bright and enormous in the telling. In truth, it had the quality of something long overdue, something the world had been slowly arranging for years, pulling its threads tight, drawing its figures together across vast distances toward a single necessary moment. Hector had been the greatest defender of Troy through all the long years of the war, the one who had held the city together, who had kept courage alive behind those walls, whose presence on the field had meant that Troy endured. He was not a villain. Even those who were his enemies would have told you that. He was a husband and a father and a son, a man who fought for his home and his people with everything he had, who prayed to the same broad sky and washed his hands in the same river water, and lay awake at night with the same human fears as any man. But he had also been the one who stripped the armor from the body of Patroclus where he fell, and this was the weight that Achilles carried now across the dry grass of the plain. The Trojans, seeing Achilles return, feeling the changed quality of the morning, fell back toward their walls. Hector had been standing outside the Scaean gates, the great gates through which so many sorties had poured out over the years. And the story goes that his own parents stood on the walls above and called down to him, his father Priam and his mother Hecuba, begging him with everything they had to come inside, to let the walls stand between him and what was coming. And Hector heard them. He was a man who heard things, who felt the weight of the people who loved him, but he stayed where he was, outside the gate, in the open morning air, because there are some moments that cannot be stepped away from without losing something essential. And Hector understood this, with the quiet clarity of a man who has always known what he is. When Achilles came close enough to see, the story goes that Hector's nerve broke, not from cowardice exactly, but from something more honest, from the simple animal understanding of what was approaching. And he ran. He ran around the walls of Troy, and Achilles pursued him, and the two of them moved around the great circuit of the city, like figures caught in a terrible slow wheel, the watching armies still on either side, the sun climbing, the walls of Troy passing again and again on one side, and the flat plains stretching on the other. 3 times they ran the full circuit, it is said, and those watching from the walls and those watching from the Greek lines stood in a silence that had nothing in it of excitement, only of recognition, the way you recognize a dream you have had before. Then the wheel stopped. The chase ended. Hector turned and stood to face what was coming. And there in the late morning light, with the walls of his city behind him, and the plain of Troy before him, and the distant blue line of the sea visible beyond the Greek ships, he and Achilles came together at last. It was brief, as these things often are, after so long a preparation. Achilles, knowing the armor Hector wore, the armor that had been Achilles' own, taken from Patroclus, knew its weakness, knew the place at the throat, where the pieces did not quite meet. And the spear found that place, and Hector fell, and the dust of the plain of Troy received him, and the long work he had done for his city was done. What happened after the fighting was harder to look at than the fight itself. Grief is a strange country, and Achilles in his grief was not always recognizable as the generous and luminous being that other parts of his story reveal. He was a man with a man's capacity for excess, a man's capacity to push past what is right when loss has broken the usual boundaries of the self. The poets tell of things done in the first raw days that were not worthy of him, and the old storytellers do not shy away from this, because they understood that the most complete accounting of a hero includes his shadows, that a person cannot be truly known if only the bright parts are recorded. But then the days moved forward, as days always do, and the sea went on making its sound against the shore, and the morning returned again, and something in Achilles began to find its way back towards stillness. Grief is not a single note, but a long, slow chord, and even its sharpest frequencies soften in time, not because the loss grows smaller, but because the person carrying it grows, slowly, more able to hold it with open hands rather than clenched ones. There would come a night, not far from this one, when a very old man would make his way by darkness across the plain between the two armies, alone except for a single guide, making for the tent of Achilles on the shore. He would come with a ransom and with empty hands. He would come as a father, and something in Achilles, that deep, quiet part that had always been there beneath the brightness and the speed, would rise to meet him. But that is the story that waits in the next gentle hour, and it can wait a little longer while the sea keeps moving in the dark, while the fires burn down to their warmth, while you rest here on this shore at the edge of sleep. The fire had burned low by the time the old man came. It was the deep middle of the night, that hour when even the sentries along the Greek encampment had grown still and drowsy at their posts, when the Aegean murmured softly against the hulls of the beached ships in its slow, perpetual conversation with the shore, and when the plain of Troy lay quiet under a sky thick with stars, the kind of stars that seemed closer in that part of the world, heavier somehow, as though the heavens themselves leaned down in the darkness to listen to what passes below. The tents of the Myrmidon camp sat apart from the others, a little distance from the main lines, and the tent of Achilles was the largest among them, though it was not, even now, a place of comfort exactly. It was a place of grief held very still, the way water in a deep basin holds still when nothing disturbs it, concealing beneath that surface a depth that is almost impossible to measure. Achilles was awake. It is said that he had not slept much at all in those days since Patroclus was gone, that he would lie in the darkness listening to the sea, or rise before the dawn to walk along the waterline alone, or sit by the fire as it died and stare into the embers, the way a man stares at something that is no longer there. The gods had already spoken to him by this time, had already told him that his own death was woven close into the fabric of the days ahead, and he had heard this without flinching, because there are losses that make the idea of one's own ending feel almost beside the point, almost restful to contemplate. The death of Hector had not stilled him the way he had imagined it would. It had closed something, yes, but what it closed was a door that had already led nowhere he wanted to go. And then the old man was at his threshold. The story goes that the god Hermes had guided Priam through the Greek lines in the darkness, had drawn a veil of divine protection around the old king and his herald, and the wagon loaded with ransom, gold and fine cloth and crafted things of beauty, 12 robes and 12 cloaks, the kind of treasures that in another time, in a different world, would have been exchanged at a wedding feast rather than at the door of an enemy's tent. It is said that Hermes led them like a shepherd leads something precious through the dark, past the sleeping sentries and the dying fires of the Greek camp, down to where the Myrmidons lay resting and Achilles sat alone, and then the god withdrew, as gods do. Leaving the mortal moment entirely to the mortals, Priam entered. He crossed the threshold, and moved through the space between the entrance and the place where Achilles sat. And he did something that even those who heard this story long afterward found difficult to fully hold in the mind. He knelt. He knelt before the man who had killed his son, and he took Achilles' hands in his own hands, those hands that had done what they had done, and he held them, and he kissed them. The story goes that he spoke then of his own father, of the old King Peleus far away in Phthia, also old now, also sitting somewhere without his son beside him, and that he asked Achilles to think of that father, to find in the thought of Peleus some thread of feeling that might reach across the terrible distance between them and touch the thing that they shared. Achilles wept, and then Priam wept, and for a time neither of them spoke, and the fire between them was very low, its coals glowing softly in the darkness, and the sound of the sea came through the walls of the tent with its old and patient rhythm, the same sound it makes against every shore, in every age, indifferent to heroes and to grief, and to the wars that men build and inhabit for years, until the wars themselves become a kind of home. What is remarkable about this moment, sitting quietly inside it now, is not the drama of it, though it is certainly one of the most charged meetings one might imagine. King and enemy, father and killer, old age and young grief, face to face across a small fire. What is remarkable is the simplicity of what they found there. They found, the story tells us, each other. They found that the particular shape of their losses, though arrived at from opposite directions, occupied the same kind of interior space, that hollow place inside a person where someone beloved used to be. Achilles mourning Patroclus, Priam mourning Hector, and behind Hector, the long roll of his other sons who had fallen in this same war. 50 sons, the poets say, Priam had, and most of them gone now into the earth of the plain that lay between the city walls and the Greek ships. And beyond even that loss, Priam mourning the city itself, great Troy with its high towers and its busy streets, and its smell of bread and wine and horses in the morning, because by now any king with eyes to see knew what the end of this war would bring. Achilles looked at the old man across the fire, and what he saw, the poets suggest, was something that surprised him. He saw beauty, in its oldest and most austere form, the beauty of a man who has endured everything a man can endure, and has not been diminished by it, who has walked through the dark camp of his enemies alone and old and unarmed and trembling, carrying nothing but love for his dead son, and the fierce, simple hope that even in the heart of the man who killed that son there might be something that could hear him. Achilles is said to have been moved by this in a way that war had not moved him, in a way that his own approaching death had not moved him. He helped Priam to his feet. He was gentle. He agreed. He would release the body of Hector. He would give Priam 12 days of truce for the funeral rites, 12 days in which the war would pause, and the fires of mourning could burn in Troy without the added fear of attack. 12 days in which something almost like peace would lie over the plain. He asked Priam to eat with him, and Priam did, and it is said that they sat together and ate, and looked at each other, and found in this the strangest, and perhaps the most human thing the Iliad has to offer us across all these centuries. Two enemies sharing bread, sharing the sight of each other's faces in firelight, briefly, quietly, without hatred. There is a line the poets give to Achilles in this moment, or something like a line, a sentiment that the story has carried forward through all the long ages since. He says, in essence, that the gods have arranged things so that suffering is the mortal portion, that grief is woven into the fabric of being human, and that even the gods cannot change this, only witness it. This is not a comforting thing to say, exactly, but it is an honest thing, and in its honesty there is a kind of compassion, the compassion of one person saying to another, I know, I am here too. In this same darkness, under these same stars, breathing the same night air that tastes of salt and old wood smoke and the sea, they made a bed for Priam in the covered porch of the tent, because it would not do for the old king to be seen by the Greek commanders, who might not honor what Achilles had agreed to, and Priam slept there, actually slept, which seems almost miraculous given everything, slept as though the agreement itself was a kind of shelter, a roof against the worst of the storm. And Achilles lay down inside and rested, and outside the Aegean moved in the dark, and the stars turned their slow wheel overhead, and the fire burned down to its last warmth and held it as long as it could. The body of Hector would go home to Troy in the morning. The city would mourn for 12 days, and the sound of that mourning would drift out across the walls and across the plain, and the Greeks in their camp would hear it and know what it meant, and perhaps some of them would feel the echo of it in their own chests in a way they could not quite name. And after those 12 days the war would resume, and everything that was fated to happen would happen, as it was always going to. But that is still ahead, still gently waiting in the days to come. For now there is only this, an old man sleeping in the tent of his enemy, under stars, near the sea, briefly at rest. The sun is going down over the Aegean now, and the water is changing color the way it only does in that last slow hour before dark. The deep blue softening first to violet, then to something closer to pewter, then to a shade that has no name in any language, a color that belongs only to the sea at the end of a long day, when the light has finished its work and is ready to rest. The waves come in small and quiet, barely lifting themselves onto the sand before they fall back, as though even the sea is tired tonight, as though the sea too is ready to let the story go. You have been here for a long time now along these shores. You have walked the mountain with the boy and the centaur, breathing in the pine resin and the cold, clean air of Pelion. You have sat in the sea caves where Thetis sang to her child in a voice that was neither fully divine nor fully mortal, but something aching and in between. You have crossed to Skyros and felt the heat of island stone underfoot, and watched the fig trees hold their stillness in the windless afternoon, and listened to the sound of a lyre played softly behind a courtyard wall. You have stood at Aulis in the dead, breathless air, watching the fleet lie motionless on water that refused to move, the sails hanging like sleeping things, the men waiting without knowing how long the waiting would be. And then the wind came at last, as winds always come eventually, and you crossed the water with the fleet, and the shore of Troy rose out of the sea mist like something remembered from a dream. And you have lived in the camp, in that strange other world between the black ships and the high wall, where cook fires burned through the long Trojan nights, and men told stories to pass the hours, and the sea was always there at your back, always breathing, always present, a reminder of the world beyond this one. You have felt the weight of 9 years pressed down upon those shores, the slow accumulation of seasons, each one like a layer of sediment settling over the men and their purposes, wearing the edges off everything, the certainty, the eagerness, the clarity of why they had come. You were there when the quarrel broke. You felt the air change in the assembly, the way a storm changes the air before it arrives, a kind of pressure building in the chest, a stillness before the thing that cannot be taken back is said. And you sat with Achilles afterwards in his withdrawal, in that strange suspended time when he was present and absent at once, when the war went on without him, and something in him seemed to be held very still, like water behind a dam, waiting. You have sat with Patroclus. You have understood in the slow, quiet way this story tells it, what that companionship meant, how two people can become so woven into one another that the boundary between them grows soft and indistinct, how the presence of another person can become the very air you breathe without noticing until it is gone. You have watched Patroclus take up the armor, bronze catching the morning light, and you have sat with Achilles by the ships and felt the quality of that waiting, which was different from all the other waitings, heavier, with something unasked underneath it, a dread that had not yet found its shape. And when the shape came, when the news arrived on the beach like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples moved outward in all directions at once, you were there for that too. You sat with the grief. You did not look away from it. You let it be what it was, not rage, not yet, but something older and quieter than rage, something that grief becomes when it is deep enough to reach the places words cannot follow. The armor made new by a god's hands, bright and impossible, carrying the whole sky in its shield, and the encounter with Hector, which the story tells not as a moment of glory, but as a moment of inevitability. Two men arrived at the point that the story had always been moving toward, the way a river arrives at the sea, not because it chose to, but because that is the nature of water, to find its level, to go where it must go. And afterwards, the stillness again, the grief folding back on itself, doubled now, grief laid over grief, and you were there in the night, the quietest night in all of this long story, when an old man came across the dark plain with gifts and with courage and with nothing left to lose, and sat across a fire from the man who had killed his son. And they looked at one another, and something passed between them that was neither forgiveness nor understanding, but something simpler and more true than either of those things. Recognition, perhaps. The recognition that grief makes equals of everyone it touches, that loss speaks a language all people share, regardless of which side of which wall they stand on. It is said, and the story has always carried this in its depths like something felt more than spoken, that Achilles knew, from very early, how the story would end for him. Not the details, perhaps, but the shape of it, the prophecy that clung to him like sea salt clings to skin, a long life in obscurity, or a short life in the kind of remembrance that outlasts empires. He chose the short life, or perhaps the choosing was not so clean as that. Perhaps he simply moved toward what called to him, the way the sea moves toward the shore, not choosing but arriving, not deciding but becoming. And what he became, what this story has been quietly building toward in all these long and gentle hours, is not the invincible warrior, not the wrathful hero, not the figure of bronze and terror that later ages sometimes made of him. What he became, in the telling of it, is something more like this: a person of extraordinary feeling, a person in whom everything, love, loss, pride, tenderness, fury, grief, ran at the highest possible pitch, like a string tuned almost to breaking, making music precisely because of the tension, because of the thinness of the margin between song and silence. The sea-nymph's son, the child between two worlds, never entirely at home in either, too mortal to be divine, too close to the divine to be entirely at peace among mortals. The boy who learned music and medicine in a mountain cave, who knew the names of the healing herbs and the songs that went with them, who could be gentle as well as fierce. The young man hidden among women on a quiet island, wearing the guise of something he was not, until the sound of armor called something in him that could not be resisted. The person whose heart was perhaps his most defining feature, as much as his speed or his strength or his terrible bright anger. And the anger itself, even that looked at from this distance, from this shore, in this quiet light, was a kind of love. It came from love. It came from the depth of what he felt, from the impossibility of accepting the world as it was, when the world had taken something irreplaceable. The anger was grief wearing the only armor it could find. The Aegean is very dark now. The last of the light has left the water, and the stars are beginning to come, one by one, the way they always have above this sea, above these shores, above all the centuries that have passed since these stories were first told beside fires, not so different from the ones that burned in the camp below the walls of Troy. Somewhere out there on the water, the island of Skyros is a shape in the dark. Somewhere further, the plain of Troy lies quiet under the stars, the great walls long since fallen, the city given back to grass and wind and the patient work of time. And Achilles, the boy, the hero, the friend, the grieving one, the swift-footed son of a sea goddess and a mortal king. Achilles rests now in the amber of the story that carried him. Not gone, never quite gone, still running on that ancient shore whenever the story is told, still playing his lyre in the firelight, still holding his companion close on the last night before everything changed, still human enough to weep, still God-touched enough to make you wonder. Let the waves come in, let them go back. Let the dark settle over the Aegean like a blanket drawn gently over a sleeping world. The age of heroes is fading into its own long, beautiful night, and it is asking nothing of you now but this: to let your own eyes close, to let your own breath slow, to let the salt wind carry you gently away from the shore and into the quiet waters of sleep, where the stories continue in the soft and shoreless depths of dreaming. Good night, wherever you are in the world. Sleep well.